There are men who destroy kingdoms and men who destroy themselves, but Adrian Blackthorne accomplished both with such spectacular precision that even his enemies had to admire the artistry of his collapse. Picture this: a duke who once commanded entire rooms with a single glance, reduced to standing outside locked gates of his own estate, rain-soaked and trembling, begging servants who no longer recognized his authority to let him inside. The fall happened so fast that society couldn't decide whether to pity him or frame the wreckage as a cautionary tale for their children. But here's what nobody understood until it was far too late. Adrian didn't fall because he loved the wrong woman. He fell because he never learned that some people aren't meant to be possessed, only cherished. And by the time he figured out the difference, the woman who could have saved him had already walked away forever. If you want to understand how a man loses everything while believing he's winning, stay with me, because this story doesn't go where you think it does. The Blackthorne estate looked like something out of a fever dream on the night of the midsummer ball, all gilded edges and champagne rivers flowing through marble halls that had witnessed 3 centuries of aristocratic excess. Adrian Blackthorne stood at the top of the grand staircase in his tailored midnight blue jacket, surveying his kingdom with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no in his entire privileged existence. 34 years old, devastatingly handsome in that cruel way that made women forgive his worst impulses, and absolutely convinced that the world existed primarily to confirm his own magnificence. Below him, 300 guests pretended to enjoy themselves while secretly calculating which scandal would emerge from tonight's festivities. The orchestra played something French and appropriately expensive. Crystal chandeliers threw diamonds of light across women in gowns that cost more than most people earned in a year. And in the center of it all, moving through the crowd with the kind of grace that couldn't be taught or bought, was Vivian, his wife, his duchess. His greatest achievement, or so he'd told himself for the past 7 years. She wore emerald green silk that night, custom designed to complement her dark auburn hair and fair skin. The dress probably cost a fortune, but Adrian never asked about such things because money was limitless when your family name appeared in history books dating back to the Norman conquest. What mattered was how every man in the room tracked her movement with barely concealed hunger, while their wives seethed with jealousy so thick you could taste it in the champagne. Adrian watched Vivian pause to speak with Lord Pemberton's insufferable wife, watched her smile with that perfect combination of warmth and distance that kept people desperate for her approval. She'd mastered the art of making everyone feel special while revealing absolutely nothing real about herself. It was one of the things he'd fallen for originally, back when he still believed he could crack her open and discover whatever secret made her so maddeningly self-contained. 7 years later, he'd given up trying. A hand touched his elbow, and Adrian turned to find James Whitmore, his oldest friend and occasional moral compass, holding 2 glasses of scotch that probably cost more than the average wedding. "So when does the real party start?" James asked, handing over one of the glasses. "Because this elegant bullshit is making my teeth hurt." Adrian smiled the way wolves smile before they bite. "Patience. The night's still young." James studied him with the kind of uncomfortable perception that came from knowing someone since boarding school, back when they were both arrogant little sociopaths in training. "You've got that look," he said carefully, "the one that usually precedes something monumentally stupid." "I have no idea what you mean." "Yes, you do. You're planning something, and I can already tell I'm going to hate it." Adrian sipped his scotch and watched Vivian excuse herself from the conversation, gliding toward the balcony doors with the unhurried elegance of someone who'd never rushed anywhere in her life. The moonlight caught her profile as she stepped outside, and something twisted in his chest, some ancient echo of whatever he'd felt when he first saw her at that tedious garden party in Surrey all those years ago. She'd been 21 then, visiting from some minor branch of the Ashford family that barely registered on his social radar. He'd been 27 and freshly titled after his father's sudden death, drunk on power and possibility, convinced the world was his personal playground. Vivian had been sitting alone under a willow tree, reading poetry and completely ignoring the elaborate mating dance happening around her. He'd approached out of boredom and stayed out of fascination. Within 6 months, they were married in a ceremony that made the society pages for weeks. Within a year, she'd transformed herself into the perfect duchess, mastering every unspoken rule of aristocratic performance with eerie precision. and within 2 years, Adrian had convinced himself that possessing her was the same thing as knowing her. The mistake would cost him everything, but he didn't know that yet. "Your wife is too good for you," James said quietly, following Adrian's gaze toward the balcony. "You know that, right?" Adrian finished his scotch. "Everyone's too good for someone. That's what makes life interesting. That's what makes you dangerous. Same thing." James sighed the way he always did when Adrian said something casually cruel and accurate. "One day you're going to push her too far and she's going to leave. And when that happens, don't come crying to me about how you didn't see it coming." Adrian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Vivian won't leave. She has too much invested in being the perfect Duchess." "You sure about that?" "Absolutely. She built her entire identity around this life. Where would she even go?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. James opened his mouth to respond, but someone called his name from across the room, and he gave Adrian one last concerned look before disappearing into the crowd. Adrian stood alone at the top of the staircase, master of everything he surveyed, and felt nothing but a vague restlessness that no amount of wealth or status or admiration seemed capable of satisfying. He didn't see Celeste approach until she was already beside him. Vivian's younger sister by 4 years, equally beautiful, but in a sharper, hungrier way that set off alarm bells in anyone with functioning survival instincts. She wore a dress the color of fresh blood and a smile that suggested she knew at least 3 of your darkest secrets. "Quite the party," she murmured, standing close enough that he caught her perfume, something expensive and deliberate. "My sister really outdid herself with the planning." Adrian glanced at her sideways. "You say that like it surprises you. Nothing Vivian does surprises me anymore. She's terrifyingly competent. High praise coming from you." Celeste's smile sharpened. "Is it? I thought I was just stating facts." They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the guests below perform their elaborate rituals of status and judgment. Adrian had known Celeste almost as long as he'd known Vivian, had watched her grow from an awkward teenager into this dangerous creature beside him. She'd always looked at him with a particular intensity that he'd found flattering in the beginning and convenient later on. Much later, he would recognize it as the look of someone who wanted to take rather than give. But recognition without wisdom is just information, and information without action might as well be fiction. "She's on the balcony," Celeste said casually, "in case you were wondering." "I wasn't. Liar. You've been watching her all night like a starving man looking at food he can't quite reach." Adrian tensed. "Careful." "Why?" "We're family. I can say things other people can't. Family means you should know better." Celeste laughed, low and intimate. "Family means I know you better than anyone except maybe Vivian, and I'm not convinced she really knows you at all. You have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I?" She turned to face him fully, green eyes blazing with something Adrian couldn't quite name. "I've watched you for years, Adrian. I've seen how you look at her, how you circle around her like she's some puzzle you can't solve. And I've seen how it drives you insane that she won't give you whatever it is you think you need from her. This conversation is over." "Is it?" "Because from where I'm standing, it feels like it's just beginning." She touched his arm, fingers trailing down to his wrist, in a gesture that could have been innocent, except nothing about Celeste had been innocent since she turned 18. Adrian should have pulled away. He didn't. Later, when the entire house of cards collapsed around him, he would trace the beginning of his destruction back to this exact moment. Not to the actual betrayal that came later, but to this instant when he felt Celeste's fingers on his skin and thought, not no, but why not? The human capacity for self-destruction is a marvel of nature. We build elaborate justifications for our worst impulses, convincing ourselves that we're simply taking what we deserve, that the rules don't apply to us, that this time will be different. Adrian Blackthorne was a master of such justifications, a virtuoso of rationalization who could convince himself that black was white if the lie was convenient enough. He pulled his arm away smoothly, maintaining appearances. "You should probably check on your sister," he said coldly. "Make sure she hasn't bored herself to death talking to the aristocratic fossils." Celeste's smile never wavered. Of course. Wouldn't want her getting lonely out there in the dark. She disappeared into the crowd like smoke, leaving Adrian alone again with his thoughts and his scotch and a creeping sense that he'd just made a choice without realizing it. He found Vivian exactly where Celeste had predicted, standing at the balcony railing with her face tilted toward the moon. She looked impossibly serene, like a painting of a duchess rather than an actual woman, and Adrian felt that familiar surge of frustrated desire that had characterized their marriage from the beginning. "Hiding from your own party," he said, stepping out to join her. She didn't turn, just breathing. It gets suffocating in there sometimes. "You planned it. You invited them." "I know. Doesn't make it less exhausting." Adrian moved to stand beside her, close enough to touch, but maintaining that invisible distance that had grown between them over the years. Below, the manicured garden stretched out in geometric perfection, every hedge precisely trimmed, every flower bed exactly balanced. Control masquerading as beauty. "They're all talking about us," he said. "They're always talking about us." "That's what we're for." "And what are we for exactly?" Vivian finally looked at him, and Adrian was struck, as he always was, by how little he could read in her expression. She'd perfected the art of the mask so thoroughly that sometimes he wondered if there was anything underneath anymore. "We're for maintaining appearances," she said quietly, "for providing entertainment and aspiration and cautionary tales depending on the audience. We're living proof that fairy tales exist even though everyone knows they don't. You sound tired." "I am tired. I've been tired for years." The admission hung between them like a confession. Adrian wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to dig deeper into whatever truth she'd just revealed, but the effort seemed enormous, and he'd never been good at emotional excavation when the findings might implicate him. "The party will be over soon," he said instead. "Then you can rest." Vivian smiled, sad and knowing. "Yes, the party will be over soon." She turned back to the gardens, and Adrian stood beside her in silence, both of them alone together. Both of them performing their respective roles with the weary precision of actors who'd played the same scene too many times. Neither of them knew that this would be one of their last civil conversations. Neither of them could see the wreckage coming, but it was already there, building in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to collapse everything they'd built into ruins. Barsasi. The affair started 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon when Vivian was visiting her mother in Bath, and Adrian was supposed to be reviewing estate documents in his study. Celeste arrived unannounced, letting herself in through the side entrance like she'd done 100 times before. She found him exactly where she expected, sprawled in his leather chair with whiskey and paperwork, looking restless and dangerous in the way that had attracted her since she first understood what attraction meant. "You look bored," she said from the doorway. Adrian glanced up, unsurprised. Devastatingly bored. "These accounts are punishment for crimes I haven't even committed yet. Want some company?" "Depends on the company." Celeste walked into the study with the confidence of someone who'd already won an argument that hadn't started yet. She wore a simple dress the color of midnight, nothing elaborate, but it clung in ways that made elaboration unnecessary. Adrian should have told her to leave. He didn't. She poured herself whiskey from his private stock, the expensive Scottish single malt he kept locked away from guests. The casual presumption of it should have annoyed him, but instead it felt like a dare, like she was testing boundaries just to see which ones he'd defend. "Vivian doesn't drink this," Celeste observed, settling into the chair across from him. "Vivian doesn't drink much at all." "No, she's too controlled for that. Too perfect." There was acid in the observation, jealousy wrapped in admiration, wrapped in something darker, that Adrian chose not to examine too closely. "You say that like it's a bad thing," he said. "Isn't it? All that perfection gets exhausting to watch. Makes you wonder what she's hiding underneath. Maybe she's not hiding anything. Maybe she's just genuinely that composed." Celeste laughed, sharp and knowing. "Nobody's that composed, Adrian. Everybody's hiding something, even your perfect Duchess." She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, eyes locked on his with an intensity that should have sent him running. "The question is what you're hiding. Because I know you're not happy. I never said I wasn't happy. You didn't have to. I can see it. The way you look at her like she's a locked door and you lost the key years ago. The way you drink alone in here instead of spending time with your wife. The way you smile at parties like you're performing rather than participating." Adrian set down his whiskey carefully. "You're overstepping." "Am I? Or am I just saying what everyone thinks but nobody has the courage to tell you? What everyone thinks is irrelevant." "Is it?" Celeste stood up, moving around the desk with deliberate slowness. "Because from where I'm sitting, everyone thinks you married a beautiful woman who's excellent at playing Duchess, but terrible at being a wife. That's enough." But she kept coming, kept talking, kept pushing until she was standing right in front of him, close enough that he could count her heartbeats if he wanted. "I'm not trying to insult Vivian," she said softly. "I'm just telling you what you already know. You're lonely, Adrian. You've been lonely for years." And she's too busy being perfect to notice. Her hand found his shoulder, and Adrian felt the world narrow to a single point of contact, a single decision that would determine everything that came after. He could push her away. He could tell her to leave. He could choose loyalty over desire, commitment over impulse. The woman who'd stood beside him for 7 years over the woman who'd waited in the shadows even longer. He could make the right choice. He didn't. When he kissed Celeste, it felt like falling and flying simultaneously, like relief and damnation wrapped together so tightly he couldn't tell them apart. She tasted like whiskey and ambition and every bad decision he'd ever made, and for those first few seconds, Adrian convinced himself this was exactly what he needed. The rationalization would get easier with practice. They would tell themselves this was about loneliness, about connection, about finding comfort in a marriage that had grown cold through no fault of anyone in particular. They would build entire narratives about how Vivian had pulled away first, how she'd chosen perfection over intimacy, how this was just two people seeking warmth in a world that valued appearances over authenticity. All lies, of course. Beautifully constructed lies that felt true enough to believe. The affair continued for 3 years. 3 years of stolen afternoons and whispered phone calls and elaborate deceptions that required more creativity than either of them had ever applied to anything legitimate. They met in hotel rooms across London, in the summer house on the coast that nobody used anymore, in the very estate where Vivian slept peacefully in the next wing, trusting the two people who were systematically betraying her. Adrian told himself he was compartmentalizing, that he could keep his marriage and his affair in separate boxes that never touched. Celeste told herself she was taking what she deserved, that Vivian had everything and didn't appreciate any of it, that this was just cosmic redistribution of resources. Both of them were masters of self-deception. Both of them believed they were getting away with it, and for those 3 years, they were right. Vivian discovered the truth on a Thursday evening in late autumn, when the world was bleeding color and the estate felt particularly empty despite being full of staff and guests and all the machinery of aristocratic life. She'd returned early from a charity function in Surrey, claiming a headache that was actually just exhaustion from maintaining her perfect Duchess performance for 5 straight hours. The driver dropped her at the main entrance, and she sent him away because she wanted silence, wanted stillness, wanted just a few hours where she didn't have to be anything to anyone. The house was quiet when she entered, too quiet. She found them in Adrian's private study, the one room in the entire estate that was supposed to be his sanctuary, his space, the place where he retreated when the weight of being Duke Blackthorne became too much to carry gracefully. They weren't having sex when she walked in. That might have been cleaner somehow, easier to process. Instead, they were sitting together on the leather sofa, Celeste's head on Adrian's shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at something on his laptop with the easy intimacy of people who'd stopped hiding from each other years ago. Vivian stood in the doorway for approximately 10 seconds before Adrian sensed her presence and looked up. The expression on his face was perfect evidence that guilt exists even in the most hardened hearts. He went white, then red, then white again, all his aristocratic composure evaporating like morning fog in sunlight. Celeste, to her credit, didn't even pretend to be surprised. She simply looked at Vivian with something approaching pity and said, "I suppose this was inevitable." Vivian felt the world tilt sideways, felt every assumption she'd built her life on crack and splinter and collapse into rubble. She'd suspected, of course. Some part of her had known for months that something was wrong, that Adrian had grown more distant, that Celeste visited too often and stayed too late and looked at him with too much hunger. But suspicion and confirmation are different animals entirely. "How long?" she heard herself ask, surprised her voice still worked. Adrian stood up, hands raised like he was approaching a dangerous animal. "Vivian, listen. How long?" The question came out harder this time, sharp enough to cut. Celeste answered before Adrian could formulate whatever lie he was preparing. 3 years. Give or take a few months. The number hit Vivian like a physical blow. 3 years. 3 years of dinners together where they all pretended to be family. 3 years of holidays and birthdays and careful choreography. 3 years of Vivian playing the perfect Duchess while her husband and her sister built an entire relationship in the shadows. 3 years of being made a fool. She looked at Adrian, really looked at him for maybe the first time in their entire marriage, and saw him clearly. The weakness disguised as confidence, the cruelty disguised as charm, the bottomless need for validation that no amount of love or loyalty would ever fill. "I want both of you out of this house," she said quietly. "Tonight." Adrian found his voice finally, that smooth, aristocratic drawl that had convinced so many people he was worth their time and trust. "Vivian, you're being emotional. Let's talk about this like adults." "I am being an adult. Adults remove toxic things from their environment. You're toxic. She's toxic. Get out." "This is my house," Adrian said, and there was steel in his voice now, the entitlement showing through. "You don't get to throw me out of my own estate." Vivian smiled, and it was the saddest thing Adrian had ever seen. "Watch me." She turned and walked out of the study, heels clicking on marble with metronomic precision. Adrian followed, Celeste trailing behind like a dark shadow, and they found Vivian already in the main hall giving instructions to Maxwell, the head butler who'd served the Blackthorne family for 30 years. "Pack his Grace's things," she said calmly. "He'll be staying elsewhere until further notice." Maxwell's face remained professionally neutral, but his eyes flickered with something that might have been satisfaction. "Of course, Your Grace." Adrian grabbed Vivian's arm, spinning her to face him. "You can't do this. You have no authority here." She pulled free with surprising strength. "I have every authority." "Or have you forgotten that half this estate came from my family's dowry, the half you've been systematically draining to fund your lifestyle and your mistress?" "That's not—" "Don't lie to me anymore, Adrian. I've known about the missing money for months. I just didn't know where it was going until tonight." The admission hung in the air like poison. Adrian's face cycled through several emotions before settling on cold anger, the look he used when people didn't behave the way he expected. "If you throw me out, you'll be the scandal of the season," he said. "Everyone will know. Everyone will talk." Vivian met his gaze without flinching. "Good. Let them talk. Let them know exactly what kind of man Duke Adrian Blackthorne really is." Celeste stepped forward, trying one last manipulation. "Vivian, please. You're my sister. Can't we—" Vivian turned on her with such sudden fury that Celeste actually stepped back. "I don't have a sister anymore. A sister wouldn't do this. A sister wouldn't spend 3 years destroying the person who loved her most in the world." "I never meant to hurt you," Celeste said, and almost sounded like she believed it. "No, you just meant to take what was mine, which is somehow worse." Vivian looked at both of them, these two people she'd built her life around, these two people who'd systematically dismantled her trust and dignity and peace, and felt something inside her finally break free. Not break. Break free. There was a difference. "I gave you everything," she said to Adrian. 7 years of perfection. 7 years of being exactly what you needed. And it still wasn't enough because you're a black hole, Adrian. You consume everything around you and give nothing back." "That's not true," he said weakly. "Yes, it is. And the saddest part is I don't even think you know it. I don't think you're capable of knowing it." She turned to Maxwell, who'd been standing at a discreet distance. "Please ensure they're both gone within the hour. Call security if necessary." "Your Grace," Maxwell said with a slight bow, and there was definite satisfaction in his voice now. Adrian tried one more time, reaching for her with something that might have been genuine desperation. "Vivian, please, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. You can't fix betrayal, Adrian. You can only survive it. And I'm done trying to survive in a marriage that was killing me." She walked away from him then, climbed the grand staircase she'd descended 1,000 times as his Duchess, and disappeared into the east wing where her private rooms overlooked the gardens. Behind her, she heard Adrian arguing with Maxwell, heard Celeste's voice raised in protest, heard the machinery of her old life grinding to a halt. She closed the door to her bedroom, locked it, and finally allowed herself to fall apart. Adrian found himself standing outside the Blackthorne estate at midnight, his belongings stuffed into suitcases by servants who wouldn't meet his eyes, with nowhere to go and nobody to call who wouldn't judge him for the spectacular mess he'd made of his life. Celeste stood beside him, shivering in the November cold, looking significantly less confident than she had 6 hours ago. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked, and there was real fear in her voice now. Adrian didn't answer because he didn't have an answer. The hotels would all know him. His friends would all have heard by morning. The entire aristocratic world he'd commanded so easily was about to become a prison of his own making. "This will blow over," Celeste said, trying to convince herself more than him. "She'll calm down. She'll take you back. She always does." But even as she said it, both of them knew it was a lie. Vivian Ashford Blackthorne had spent 7 years being the perfect Duchess, playing the role with flawless precision, giving everything and asking for almost nothing in return. That woman was gone. And in her place was someone neither of them recognized, someone who'd looked at them both and chosen herself instead. Adrian stood in the rain, watching the lights in the east wing go dark one by one, and felt the first cold fingers of consequence wrap around his throat. He'd gambled everything on the belief that Vivian would forgive him the way she'd forgiven 1,000 smaller betrayals over the years. He'd been catastrophically wrong. But the worst part, the part that would haunt him through everything that came after, was the look in her eyes when she told him to leave. Not anger, not pain, not even hatred, just exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who'd finally stopped performing and started surviving. Inside the estate, Vivian sat by her window and watched her husband and her sister disappear into the night, taking with them every illusion she'd built about love and loyalty and family. She should have felt victorious. She felt empty. But empty was better than broken, and broken was better than dead, and she'd been dying for years without realizing it. Now at least she was alive, damaged, betrayed, humiliated, but alive. And somewhere in that aliveness was the beginning of something new, something that belonged only to her, something nobody could take or twist or poison. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything changed. Not because she'd thrown Adrian out, because she'd finally stopped believing she needed him to survive. The real story was just beginning, and neither Adrian nor Celeste had any idea what was coming for them next. Adrian spent his first night of exile in a hotel room that cost more per night than most people earned in a week, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and staring at his phone like it might spontaneously generate solutions to problems he'd spent 3 years creating. The Dorchester had welcomed him with the kind of discretion that came standard for wealthy men in crisis, but even their practiced neutrality felt like judgment. Celeste sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the dress she'd had on when Vivian threw them out, makeup smeared from crying that had started in the car and hadn't really stopped. She looked younger than her 27 years, fragile in a way that would have moved Adrian if he'd had any emotional capacity left for anyone besides himself. "We should have been more careful," she said for maybe the 15th time. Adrian didn't respond because what was there to say? They'd been reckless because recklessness had felt like freedom, had felt like taking something instead of asking permission, had felt like power when his marriage had made him feel increasingly powerless. Now that illusion had shattered, and he was left holding nothing but consequences. His phone buzzed. James Whitmore. Adrian considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out over pride. "I assume you've seen the news," James said without preamble. "What news?" "Check your email. Or Twitter. Or literally any gossip site in London. You're trending and not in a good way." Adrian opened his laptop with hands that shook slightly from whiskey and adrenaline. The first headline made his stomach drop. Duchess Vivian throws philandering Duke out of Blackthorne estate. The second was worse. Duke Adrian's 3-year affair with wife's sister exposed. The third made him want to throw the laptop through the window. Sources close to Duchess confirm Duke systematically drained family assets to fund mistress. "How the hell did this get out so fast?" Adrian said. "You fired your wife's entire support system and thought they wouldn't talk?" James laughed without humor. "Her staff loved her, Adrian. They tolerated you. The second she gave them permission to speak freely, they sang like a choir. This is defamation. I can sue." "Can you, though?" "Because I'm looking at bank statements that suggest the asset draining part is pretty well documented. Who exactly gave those to the press?" Adrian closed his eyes. "Nobody gave them anything. Vivian wouldn't. Your wife just threw you out of your own house in front of a dozen staff members. You really think she's going to protect your reputation now? She's not vindictive." James was quiet for a long moment. "Adrian, I'm going to say this as your oldest friend. You don't know your wife at all. You never did. And that ignorance is about to cost you everything." The call ended, and Adrian sat in the expensive hotel room with its views of Hyde Park and its Egyptian cotton sheets, and felt the world closing in around him with the inexorable patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. Beside him, Celeste scrolled through her own phone. face going progressively paler as she read the social media destruction happening in real time. "They're calling me a homewrecker," she whispered. "They're saying I seduced you deliberately, that I planned this from the beginning." "Didn't you?" Adrian thought, but didn't say. Because the truth was, he didn't actually know whose idea the affair had been originally. They'd both wanted it badly enough that assigning blame felt academic. "We need a strategy," Celeste said, and there was steel underneath the tears now. That survival instinct Adrian had always found attractive, reshaping itself into something harder. "We need to control the narrative before Vivian destroys us completely. Vivian won't destroy us. She'll divorce me quietly and move on with her life." Celeste looked at him like he'd just said something profoundly stupid. The woman who threw us out in front of her entire staff and somehow got our affair trending on Twitter within 6 hours isn't going to quietly do anything. She's going to war, Adrian, and we're not prepared. For the first time since this nightmare started, Adrian felt genuine fear. Not anxiety or embarrassment or wounded pride, but actual animal fear of someone who'd finally realized they'd underestimated an opponent so thoroughly that retreat was no longer an option. His phone rang again. His lawyer this time, Bradford Cunningham, who charged £800 an hour and earned every penny. "I've reviewed the preliminary information," Bradford said in that clipped, precise way he had. "We have significant problems." Define significant. "Your wife's family contributed approximately 40% of the current estate's liquid assets via dowry and subsequent investments. If she can prove you misappropriated those funds for personal use, specifically to support a mistress, she can not only divorce you but potentially sue for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty." "That's absurd. It's my money." "Actually, it's not. The marriage contract was quite specific about asset separation and approved uses of joint funds. I'm looking at it now. Did you read this before you signed it?" Adrian had definitely not read it before signing it because he'd been 27 and drunk on new power and convinced that contracts were things that happened to other people. 7 years later, that arrogance was manifesting as a noose around his neck. "How bad is it?" he asked. "If she pursues this aggressively?" "You could lose the London properties, most of the investment portfolio, and depending on how vindictive she feels, potentially the estate itself." "The estate has been in my family for 300 years. "Yes. And you married a woman whose family law background is extensive and whose father happens to sit on the board of 3 major financial institutions. You picked possibly the worst person in England to betray this way." Adrian ended the call and looked at Celeste, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between concern and calculation, between genuine fear and opportunistic reassessment. "How much money do you have?" she asked quietly. "Excuse me?" "Money. Liquid assets. Things Vivian can't touch." "How much?" Adrian ran the numbers in his head and didn't like what they added up to. Most of his wealth was tied up in property and investments that were technically joint marital assets. His personal accounts contained maybe £200,000, which sounded like a lot until you considered his lifestyle required approximately that much every month. "Enough," he said. Celeste's expression said she knew he was lying. "We need to move fast," she said, "before Vivian freezes everything. We need to secure what we can and transfer it somewhere she can't reach. That's illegal. So is adultery in the court of public opinion. We're already criminals, Adrian. Might as well be smart about it." She stood up and started pacing, that nervous energy he'd found endearing in the beginning, now manifesting as something more predatory. "I still have access to some of the estate accounts," she said, "from when you gave me signing authority for the renovation project." Adrian felt his stomach drop. That was for the summer house renovations. £20,000. Actually, it was $50,000, and you gave me access to the secondary investment account too, remember? You said you trusted me to handle things while you were in Scotland. He did remember, vaguely, during one of those heady early affair months when trust had felt like proof of love and giving Celeste financial access had seemed romantic rather than catastrophic. "You can't touch that money," he said. "If Vivian finds out..." "Vivian already knows about the affair, Adrian." "Adrian? What's she gonna do? Divorce you twice?" The logic was airtight and completely insane, which described most of Adrian's decision-making process for the past 3 years. "How much can we move?" he heard himself ask, and hated that we had become the organizing principle of his financial strategy. Celeste pulled out her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. If we're smart about it, maybe $500,000 before anyone notices. We move it through shell accounts, park it overseas, make it look like legitimate business expenses. That's fraud. That's survival. She looked at him over the laptop screen and her eyes were bright with something Adrian was only now recognizing as ambition that had nothing to do with love. You're about to lose everything to a woman who spent 7 years being perfect just so she could destroy you the moment you gave her a reason. Are you really going to let that happen? Adrian thought about Vivian's face when she'd told him to leave. The exhaustion, the finality, the absolute absence of doubt or hesitation or mercy. His entire life he'd been taught that Blackthorns didn't lose. They adapted. They survived. They did whatever was necessary to maintain their position because position was everything and everything else was just details. Do it, he said. Move what you can. Celeste smiled and it should have warned him, but Adrian was too far gone to recognize warnings anymore. Vivian spent her first night of freedom sleeping better than she had in 3 years. She woke up at 7, had coffee in the conservatory while reading the morning papers, and felt something that might have been peace if peace wasn't so unfamiliar. Maxwell appeared at precisely 8 with a silver tray containing her correspondence and a particularly satisfied expression. The morning's headlines, Your Grace. I thought you might enjoy them. Vivian glanced at the stack of newspapers, all featuring variations of her husband's humiliation, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a distant academic interest in how quickly the aristocratic world turned on its own when blood was in the water. Has he tried to contact me? She asked. 7 times. Email, phone, and he had James Whitmore call requesting a meeting to discuss arrangements. Tell Mr. Whitmore that all communication should go through my attorney. Already done, Your Grace. Maxwell paused. If I may be so bold, the staff wanted me to express their support. What you did took remarkable courage. Vivian looked at him properly for the first time in years, really seeing him instead of just processing him as part of the household machinery. He'd been with the Blackthorn family since before she married Adrian, had witnessed every moment of her transformation from hopeful bride to exhausted duchess. Thank you, Maxwell. That means more than you know. After he left, Vivian opened her laptop and reviewed the documents her attorney had prepared. The divorce petition was straightforward. The fraud investigation was not. She'd spent 6 months quietly documenting every suspicious financial transaction, every unexplained withdrawal, every convenient business expense that seemed more personal than professional. Adrian had been careless because he'd never imagined she was watching. He'd transferred money to accounts in Celeste's name, paid for hotel rooms with joint credit cards, funded jewelry purchases that never made it home to his wife. The paper trail was damning and comprehensive and exactly what Vivian needed to ensure he couldn't just walk away from this unscathed. Her phone rang. Her father, Lord Richard Ashford, calling from his estate in Surrey. I saw the news, he said without preamble. Are you all right? I'm better than all right. I'm free. That's my girl. He sounded proud in a way he hadn't since she'd first told him she was marrying Adrian, back when he'd warned her that the Blackthorns were beautiful predators who consumed everything they touched. I've already spoken with Hastings at the bank. Adrian's going to find several of his accounts frozen by end of business today. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. He humiliated my daughter and thought he'd get away with it because his family name means something. I'm going to teach him what real power looks like. Vivian felt tears sting her eyes for the first time since the confrontation. Thank you, Daddy. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly. He's going to fight back, and when he does, he's going to aim for whatever hurts most. Are you prepared for that? She thought about the woman she'd been 24 hours ago. The perfect duchess who smoothed over problems and maintained appearances and never made waves. That woman was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who'd looked at betrayal and chosen war instead of forgiveness. I'm prepared, she said. Let him try. After the call ended, Vivian walked through the estate room by room, reclaiming space that had felt like a prison for years. She stopped in Adrian's study, the place where she'd found him with Celeste, and felt nothing but clinical detachment. She could burn it all down if she wanted. The estate, the reputation, the carefully constructed legacy Adrian thought made him untouchable, but destruction was too easy and too quick. Vivian had something better in mind. Tank. 3 weeks into exile, Adrian realized Celeste was lying to him. The money she'd promised to secure kept disappearing into accounts he couldn't access. The overseas transfers never quite materialized the way she described them. When he asked direct questions, she gave vague answers wrapped in reassurances that everything was under control. By the 4th week, he'd lost access to 2 of his personal credit cards and discovered that Vivian had frozen the joint accounts with surgical precision, leaving him exactly enough money to survive, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle that defined him. James found him in a significantly less expensive hotel in Kensington, looking like he hadn't slept in days because he hadn't. "You look terrible," James said, settling into the chair across from Adrian with the careful distance of someone approaching a volatile chemical. "I feel worse. I heard about the accounts. Vivian's playing for keeps." Adrian laughed bitterly. "She's playing chess while I'm playing checkers. I didn't even know she knew how to be ruthless. Everyone knows how to be ruthless when you push them hard enough. You just assumed she'd never push back." James ordered whiskey for both of them, even though it was barely noon, because some conversations required chemical courage. "Where's Celeste?" he asked. "Honestly? I don't know. She's been avoiding me for 3 days. Says she's working on securing the transfers but won't give me details." James pulled out his phone and showed Adrian a series of bank statements that he'd obtained through methods that were probably illegal but definitely effective. "Your sister-in-law has been very busy." Adrian stared at the numbers, trying to make them make sense. Transfers from accounts he'd given Celeste access to, moving through a series of shell companies, ending up in places he didn't recognize. "She's moving my money," he said slowly. "Not your money," James corrected. "Money that technically belongs to the estate, which means Vivian has legal claim to it. Celeste is stealing from both of you. That's impossible." "She wouldn't." "Wouldn't she?" James leaned forward. "Think about it, Adrian. She spent 3 years as your mistress with no guarantees, no security, no legal claim to anything. Now you're radioactive, Vivian's coming for blood, and Celeste has access to funds that could disappear before anyone notices. What would you do?" Adrian felt the world tilt again, that same nauseating sensation of losing control he'd felt when Vivian threw him out. "I trusted her. You also trusted that Vivian would forgive you forever. Your instincts about women are spectacularly terrible." James wasn't wrong. Adrian had spent his entire adult life assuming that charm and status were sufficient substitutes for actual character, that people would accept whatever he offered because he was Duke Adrian Blackthorne, and that meant something. Turned out it meant less than he'd thought. "I need to find Celeste," he said. "I already did. She's at the Blackthorne summer house, the one in Cornwall that you gave her access to during the affair." Adrian stood up so fast the chair fell over. "That house is worth £2 million. Was worth £2 million. James pulled up another document. "She put it on the market yesterday through a private sale. Asking price is $1.8 million, cash only, quick close." The room spun. The summer house had been in his family for 150 years, a sprawling estate on the coast that had hosted everyone from minor royalty to major criminals, depending on which generation of Blackthorns you asked. Adrian had given Celeste the keys during the affair as a romantic gesture, a place where they could escape together. Now she was selling it out from under him. "Stop the sale," he said. "Can't. She's listed as co-owner on the deed. You added her 2 years ago, remember?" Another grand romantic gesture. Adrian did remember, through a haze of wine and Celeste's insistence that if he really loved her, he'd prove it with something more substantial than jewelry. He'd signed the papers without reading them because reading things was for people who didn't trust each other. The pattern was becoming clear even to him. James stood up and put a hand on Adrian's shoulder with the careful weight of someone delivering bad news to a terminal patient. "You need to accept what's happening here. Vivian is dismantling your financial empire with legal precision. Celeste is stealing whatever she can grab before everything collapses. And you're standing in the middle watching it happen because you genuinely believed you were smarter than everyone else. I can fix this." "You can't." James squeezed once and let go. "The best you can do now is minimize the damage and hope Vivian shows mercy when this goes to court." "Vivian doesn't do mercy. Then you're fucked." James left, and Adrian stood alone in his mediocre hotel room with the remains of his life scattered around him like wreckage from a particularly spectacular shipwreck. He'd lost his wife. He was losing his fortune. And the woman he'd betrayed everything for was actively robbing him blind while he watched helplessly. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his father's started laughing. Celeste stood in the Cornwall summer house watching the ocean through floor-to-ceiling windows and felt absolutely nothing about what she was doing to Adrian. The house would sell within a week. The money would disappear into accounts he'd never find, and she'd be on a plane to somewhere warm and extradition-free before he even realized she was gone. Her phone rang. The buyer's attorney confirming the accelerated closing. All cash, she confirmed. No contingencies. I need this done fast. Understood, Miss Ashford. We'll have everything ready by Friday. After the call ended, Celeste poured herself wine from Adrian's private collection and toasted her reflection in the window. She looked good. Better than she had in months. Stress had burned away the soft edges, leaving something harder and more focused in their place. She'd spent 3 years being Adrian's secret, accepting crumbs from his table, playing supporting character in the tragedy of his marriage. She'd told herself it was love, but really it had been strategy, waiting for the right moment to convert access into assets. Vivian throwing them out had been the best thing that could have happened. It gave Celeste cover to grab everything she could reach, while Adrian was too distracted by his wounded pride to notice what she was doing. Her sister would call it betrayal. Adrian would call it theft. Celeste called it compensation for services rendered. She opened her laptop and reviewed the offshore accounts one more time. $500,000 from the estate transfers. 1.8 from the summer house once it closed. Another 100,000 from jewelry and art she'd quietly removed from storage. 2.4 million pounds total. Enough to disappear. Enough to start over somewhere Adrian's name meant nothing and Vivian's vengeance couldn't reach. Enough to finally stop being anyone's second choice. Her phone buzzed with a text from the man she'd been seeing for the past 6 months. The one Adrian didn't know about, because Adrian had assumed she was as faithful to him as he expected Vivian to be. Package ready for pickup, the text said. Passport and documents waiting. Celeste smiled. The passport was Canadian, the documents were flawless, and the new identity was someone who'd never heard of the Ashford or Blackthorne families. By this time next week, Celeste Ashford would cease to exist, and the woman who replaced her would be very, very rich. Vivian's attorney called on a Tuesday with news that should have made her happy. We've frozen everything, Margaret Hastings said. Adrian has no access to any accounts tied to the estate. He's effectively broke until this is resolved in court. Good, Vivian said, but the satisfaction felt hollow. There's more. We've discovered significant asset transfers to your sister. It appears she's been systematically moving money out of accessible accounts into offshore holdings. How much? Conservative estimate? Over £500,000. Vivian closed her eyes. Her sister. Her blood. The person she'd defended and supported and loved unconditionally for 27 years had spent 3 years sleeping with her husband and the last month robbing them both blind. Can we stop her? Vivian asked. Legally? It's complicated. Some of the accounts Adrian gave her legitimate access to, but the offshore transfers and the property sale violate several laws. If you want to pursue charges, I want her found first. Then we'll talk about charges. Margaret paused. Vivian, I need to ask, how far are you willing to go with this? The question hung in the air between them. Vivian thought about the woman she'd been a month ago, the one who smoothed over problems and maintained appearances and never made waves. That woman would have let it go, would have written off the money as the cost of cutting toxic people out of her life. But that woman was dead. As far as necessary, Vivian said. They both betrayed me. They both stole from me. I want them to understand that actions have consequences, even if it destroys them, especially if it destroys them. After the call ended, Vivian sat in her conservatory and watched the sun set over gardens that finally felt like hers. She'd spent 7 years being perfect for a man who didn't deserve it and trusting a sister who'd been planning betrayal the entire time. Now she was done being perfect. Now she was going to be ruthless. And when this was over, both Adrian and Celeste would understand exactly what they'd lost when they underestimated the woman who'd spent years pretending to be weaker than she was. The war had started the night she threw them out, but the real battle was just beginning. and Vivian Ashford Blackthorne had no intention of losing. Adrian received the legal summons on a Friday morning, delivered to his hotel room by a process server who looked apologetic about ruining his day. The document was comprehensive and devastating. Vivian was suing him for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of marital assets. The attached evidence included 3 years of financial records, documented proof of the affair, and testimony from staff members who'd witnessed everything. The potential damages were catastrophic. If she won, and his lawyer admitted she probably would, Adrian could lose everything except the estate itself, and even that would be mortgaged to the point of worthlessness. His phone rang. Private number. "Hello, Adrian," Celeste said, and she sounded different, harder, more distant. "Where are you? Somewhere you'll never find me. I'm calling as a courtesy, to tell you I'm sorry it had to end this way." Adrian felt his hands start shaking. "You're stealing from me. I'm taking what I earned. 3 years of my life, Adrian. 3 years of being your secret. 3 years of watching you go home to her every night while I waited for scraps. This is compensation. You can't do this." "I already did. The summer house closes tomorrow. The money's already moved. By the time your lawyers figure out where it went, I'll be someone else somewhere else. Celeste, please, don't beg. It's beneath you." She paused. "For what it's worth, I did care about you, but you were always going to choose yourself over everyone else eventually. I just chose myself first." The line went dead. Adrian sat in his mediocre hotel room with the lawsuit in one hand and his phone in the other, and finally understood what complete and total defeat felt like. He'd lost his wife to his own arrogance. He'd lost his fortune to his own carelessness. And he'd lost his mistress to his own assumption that loyalty could be bought with access instead of earned with character. Outside his window, London continued its business with indifferent efficiency. The city had seen 1,000 men rise and fall, had witnessed dynasties built and destroyed, had absorbed countless tragedies into its ancient stones. One more ruined duke was barely worth noticing. Adrian picked up his phone and called the one person who might still answer. "James," he said, when his oldest friend picked up, "I need help." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Adrian thought the call had dropped. Then James spoke, and his voice was tired and sad and absolutely final. "No," he said. "You're on your own now." The call ended, and Adrian was alone in every way a person could be alone. No wife, no money, no allies, no future except the one he'd built with his own hands from betrayal and arrogance and the unshakable belief that consequences were things that happened to other people. He'd been wrong about everything, and now he was going to pay for it in ways he couldn't even imagine yet. The war for power was over. Vivian had won. And Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of nothing but his own destruction, was about to discover that sometimes you don't get to come back from the mistakes you make. Sometimes you just get to live with them, forever. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by courier to the cramped Kensington hotel room that had become Adrian's entire world. Heavy cardstock, gold embossing, the kind of formal announcement that used to arrive by the dozen when he was someone worth inviting to things. Mr. Adrian Blackthorne and guest are cordially invited to celebrate the engagement of Miss Celeste Ashford to Mr. Marcus Bellamy at the Grand Ballroom of the Savoy Hotel. Adrian read it 3 times before the words actually penetrated. Engagement. Celeste. A man he'd never heard of. His first thought was that it was some kind of sick joke. His second thought was that Celeste wouldn't be stupid enough to surface after disappearing with £500,000 of stolen money. His third thought, the one that made his hand shake and his vision narrow, was that she absolutely would be that stupid if she thought she'd won completely enough to celebrate publicly. He called the only person who might give him a straight answer. Margaret, Vivian's attorney, answered on the 3rd ring with the professional neutrality of someone who'd been expecting this call. "I assume you've seen the invitation," she said. "Who the hell is Marcus Bellamy? Real estate developer. Old money from Manchester. Worth approximately £15 million. And before you ask, yes, he knows about the affair." Celeste told him everything. Framed it as a tragic love story where she was seduced by a powerful older man and then abandoned when his wife found out. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Margaret's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd heard too many men claim innocence while standing in the wreckage of their own choices. Because from where I'm sitting, you did seduce her, you were powerful, and you absolutely would have abandoned her if Vivian hadn't forced the issue. Adrian wanted to argue, but the words died in his throat because she wasn't wrong. He would have kept Celeste as a mistress indefinitely, enjoying the thrill of possession without ever offering anything real or permanent. The only reason he hadn't abandoned her already was that she'd abandoned him first. Why is she doing this, he asked, and hated how weak his voice sounded. Because she can. Because she got away with it. And because she wants you to watch her win. The engagement party is in 3 days, Adrian said slowly. She's been planning this. She's been planning everything, Mr. Blackthorne. While you were busy feeling sorry for yourself, Celeste was systematically converting stolen assets into legitimate wealth, creating a new identity, and landing a rich husband who thinks she's a victim of your manipulation. Adrian felt the room spin. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. Celeste had stolen from him, disappeared, and resurfaced as a sympathetic figure engaged to someone even wealthier than Adrian had been at his peak. "Will Vivian be there?" he asked. "Of course. She received her invitation 2 days ago." Margaret paused. "She's planning something, Mr. Blackthorne. I don't know what yet, but I know my client. She's not going to let your sister-in-law parade around London society, playing the victim while Vivian's the actual casualty. Tell her not to do anything stupid. I'll tell her you said that. I'm sure she'll find it hilarious." The call ended and Adrian sat with the invitation in his hands, feeling the weight of choices he couldn't take back pressing down on him like continental drift. He could ignore the party, hide in his mediocre hotel room, let Celeste have her victory lap without witnessing it. But something in him, some last shred of the arrogant duke he used to be, couldn't accept that ending. He was going to that party, and he was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of woman Celeste Ashford really was. Betrayal. Vivian stood in her dressing room at the Blackthorne estate, studying her reflection with the clinical detachment of a general inspecting armor before battle. The dress was custom Valentino, midnight blue silk that moved like water, cut to emphasize strength rather than fragility. Sapphire earrings that had belonged to Adrian's grandmother, claimed in the divorce settlement because Vivian knew he'd hate seeing them on her. She looked powerful, untouchable. Exactly the opposite of the broken woman Celeste probably expected. Margaret Hastings sat in the corner reviewing documents on her tablet, occasionally making notes that would probably ruin someone's life in court later. "You're sure about this?" Margaret asked without looking up. Vivian fastened the second earring. "Absolutely, it's risky. If it goes wrong, it won't go wrong. I've planned for every possibility. That's what Napoleon said before Waterloo." Vivian smiled without humor. Napoleon didn't have 3 months of financial forensics and a sister stupid enough to resurface before the statute of limitations expired on fraud charges. Margaret finally looked up, and something like concern flickered across her professionally neutral expression. "This isn't just about the money anymore, is it? It never was." Vivian turned from the mirror. "This is about making sure that everyone who thought they could use me, betray me, steal from me, understands that I'm not the kind of woman who forgives and forgets. You sound like your father. Good. He taught me that power without consequences is just theater. Tonight, Celeste learns what real consequences look like. And Adrian?" Vivian's expression hardened. "Adrian gets to watch. That's his consequence. Watching the woman he betrayed everything for reveal herself as exactly the predator he should have seen coming." They left the estate in a car that cost more than most people's houses, driving through London streets that glittered with wealth and indifference. Vivian watched the city flow past and felt nothing but cold calculation. She'd spent 3 months preparing for this moment, assembling evidence and witnesses and leverage. Tonight, in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle, Celeste Ashford was going to implode, and Vivian was going to enjoy every second of it. Mats. The Savoy ballroom looked like something out of a period drama, all chandeliers and marble and enough flowers to bankrupt a small country. 300 guests in formal wear clustered in groups, drinking champagne that cost more per bottle than the servers earned in a week, pretending they weren't all there to witness whatever disaster was clearly brewing. Adrian arrived alone, wearing a suit he'd bought off the rack because his custom tailor had politely declined to extend further credit. He looked diminished somehow, like a copy of himself that had been reduced in the printing. Several people he'd considered friends saw him enter and suddenly found urgent conversations happening in opposite directions. He spotted James Whitmore near the bar and felt a flash of hope that died when James deliberately turned away. The social exile was complete. Adrian was alone in a room full of people he'd once commanded, and every single one of them knew he'd fallen because of his own choices. The humiliation was exquisite and total. Then Celeste made her entrance. She looked radiant in a way that suggested professional styling and significant financial investment. White dress that probably cost £20,000, jewelry that Adrian recognized from the estate collection, pieces she must have stolen before vanishing. And on her arm, Marcus Bellamy, 50-something and distinguished in that way wealthy men get when they have personal trainers and excellent tailors. Celeste scanned the room with practiced ease, and her gaze landed on Adrian. For just a second, something flickered in her expression. Triumph? Contempt? Fear that he might actually make a scene? But then she smiled, that same smile she'd given him 1,000 times during their affair, and Adrian understood with sudden clarity that she wasn't afraid of him at all. She'd already won. The crowd parted as Celeste and Marcus made their way through the ballroom, accepting congratulations with the gracious humility of people who'd never done anything wrong in their lives. Adrian watched her work the room, watched her touch Marcus's arm with performative affection, watched her laugh at jokes that probably weren't funny. This was the woman he'd destroyed his marriage for. This woman who'd spent 3 years playing mistress while planning her own exit strategy. This woman who'd looked him in the eye and said she loved him while systematically stealing everything she could reach. He'd been so spectacularly blind. Someone tapped a glass and the room quieted. Marcus Bellamy stood at the front of the ballroom, beaming like a man who'd won the lottery and didn't know the ticket was counterfeit. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus said in that booming, confident voice of men who'd never been told no about anything important. "Tonight, we celebrate not just an engagement, but a love story that overcame tremendous obstacles." Beside him, Celeste arranged her features into an expression of demure gratitude that made Adrian want to throw something expensive. "Celeste came into my life at a difficult time for her," Marcus continued. "She'd been through a terrible ordeal, manipulated by a powerful man who took advantage of her youth and trust." Several people glanced at Adrian. He felt his face burn but forced himself to stay still, stay silent, let Celeste have her moment before everything exploded. Because it was going to explode. He could feel it building in the air like atmospheric pressure before a storm. "But she survived," Marcus said, taking Celeste's hand. "She rebuilt herself with grace and dignity. And now she's agreed to be my wife, which makes me the luckiest man in England." The crowd applauded politely. Celeste smiled and kissed Marcus's cheek and looked for all the world like a woman who'd found her happy ending after tragedy. Then Vivian stepped into the center of the ballroom and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. She looked like vengeance in a designer dress, controlled and dangerous and absolutely certain of her next move. The crowd shifted, sensing blood, anticipating the kind of scene that would fuel gossip for months. "How touching," Vivian said, her voice carrying across the ballroom with crystalline precision. A love story built on theft, fraud, and the systematic exploitation of everyone stupid enough to trust her. Celeste's smile never wavered, but something died behind her eyes. "Vivian, how lovely to see you. I'm glad you could come celebrate with us." "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for anything." Vivian pulled a folder from her clutch, the kind of gesture that meant someone's world was about to end. "I brought a gift. Financial records showing exactly how my dear sister financed her beautiful new life." She opened the folder and began reading like she was narrating a grocery list instead of a criminal conspiracy. March 15th, unauthorized withdrawal of £75,000 from estate account 447. March 22nd, transfer of £120,000 to offshore account in the Cayman Islands. April 3rd, forged signature on property documents transferring ownership of the Cornwall summer house. The room was silent except for Vivian's voice, methodical and merciless. All told, Celeste stole approximately £900,000 over a period of 3 months. She did this while pretending to support me through my divorce, while playing the concerned sister, while already planning to resurface as a victim. "That's not true," Celeste said, but her voice shook. Vivian looked at her sister for the first time since entering the ballroom, and Adrian saw something in her expression that was worse than anger. Disappointment, grief. The look of someone who'd loved completely and been betrayed so thoroughly that love had calcified into something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Every word is true and you know it, Vivian said quietly. I have bank statements, security footage, testimony from staff who watched you move documents and jewelry. I have everything, Celeste. I've had it for months. I just waited until you felt safe enough to surface. Marcus stepped forward, face red, hands clenched. This is ridiculous. Celeste told me about you. You're jealous because she and Adrian fell in love, but... They didn't fall in love, Vivian interrupted. They had an affair while Adrian was married to me, and Celeste systematically planned to steal as much money as possible before disappearing. She moved on to you because you're wealthier than Adrian and stupid enough to believe her victim story. I'm not stupid. Then prove it. Vivian pulled out another document. Here's the real estate record for a property in Monaco purchased 2 months ago for 1.2 million euros. Cash sale. Buyer of record is a company registered in Celeste's name under a false identity. She bought herself a bolt hole, Mr. Bellamy, somewhere to run when this arrangement stopped serving her purposes. She handed him the document. Marcus read it with the slow comprehension of a man watching his future disintegrate in real time. Celeste, is this true? He asked. Celeste opened her mouth, but nothing came out because there was nothing to say that wouldn't damn her further. Adrian watched from the edge of the ballroom, feeling something like vindication mixed with horror. He'd known Celeste was ruthless, but this level of calculation was impressive in its sociopathy. She hadn't just stolen from him and Vivian. She'd been running a long con that included backup plans and exit strategies, and a complete willingness to destroy anyone who got in her way. This was the woman he'd betrayed his marriage for. This was the woman he'd thought loved him. The joke was so brutal he almost laughed. Vivian wasn't finished. I've already filed charges, she said. Fraud, theft, forgery. The prosecutors have everything they need. The only reason Celeste isn't in custody right now is because I wanted her to have this moment, this party, this celebration of her victory. She stepped closer to Celeste, close enough that only the people nearby could hear her next words. But the ballroom was so silent they carried anyway. I wanted you to feel safe, she said. I wanted you to believe you'd gotten away with it, because the fall is so much worse when you think you've already won. Celeste's face crumpled then, the mask finally shattering. You're my sister, she whispered. I was your sister. Past tense. You gave that up when you decided stealing my husband and my money was preferable to having a relationship with me. Vivian turned to Marcus, who looked like he'd aged a decade in the last 5 minutes. I'm sorry you were caught up in this, she said, with something approaching genuine sympathy. She's very good at playing the victim. But the evidence doesn't lie, and neither do offshore bank accounts. She turned and walked toward the exit with the unhurried grace of someone who'd just won a war. The crowd parted for her like water, everyone desperate to be out of her blast radius. Adrian watched her go and felt the last piece of his old life crumble into dust. Vivian had spent 3 months planning this destruction with the precision of a military campaign. She'd waited until Celeste felt safe, until the engagement was public, until the maximum number of witnesses were assembled. Then she'd destroyed her with facts and documentation and the kind of cold fury that came from betrayal by blood. Behind him, Celeste was crying now, makeup running, Marcus backing away like she was contaminated. Security was moving through the crowd, politely but firmly making their way toward her. The prosecutors had probably been waiting for Vivian's signal. The party was over. The engagement was over. And Celeste's freedom was about to be over too. Adrian should have felt satisfaction. He should have felt vindicated that the woman who'd stolen from him was finally facing consequences. Instead, he felt hollow, empty, like watching someone else's tragedy from a distance that made emotion impossible. He'd lost everything because of Celeste, his marriage, his fortune, his reputation, his future. And now she was losing everything too, which should have balanced the scales but instead just made the whole thing feel pointless. 2 people had destroyed each other over what? Desire? Ambition? The thrill of taking something forbidden? None of it had been worth it. None of it had ever been worth it. Adrian watched security reach Celeste, watched her try to run and stumble in her expensive heels, watched Marcus walk away without looking back. The crowd murmured with the ugly satisfaction of people witnessing someone else's complete collapse. He should stay. He should watch this play out to its bitter end. Instead, he turned and walked out of the Savoy into the London night, leaving behind the wreckage of who he used to be. Das. Vivian stood outside the ballroom waiting for the inevitable confrontation. It came approximately 3 minutes after the security had taken Celeste into custody, when Adrian found her in the hallway, staring at a painting of some aristocrat who'd probably also destroyed his own life through arrogance and poor choices. "That was cruel," Adrian said. Vivian didn't turn around. "It was justice. You humiliated her in front of everyone. She humiliated me for 3 years. This is just evening the score." Adrian moved to stand beside her, and Vivian noticed how diminished he looked. The expensive suits were gone, replaced with something off the rack. The confident bearing had collapsed into something hunched and defensive. He looked like what he was, a man who'd bet everything on the wrong woman and lost. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For which part? The affair? The theft? The 3 years of lying to my face? All of it." Vivian finally looked at him and felt nothing. No anger, no pain. Just a distant academic interest in the man she'd spent 7 years married to and apparently never known at all. "You're not sorry you did it," she said. "You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry there were consequences. But if Celeste hadn't stolen from you, if I hadn't thrown you out, you'd still be having your affair and thinking you were clever for getting away with it. That's not fair." "Nothing about this is fair, Adrian. Fair would have been you treating our marriage like it mattered. Fair would have been Celeste acting like family instead of a competitor. Fair would have been honesty instead of 3 years of performance." She started walking toward the exit, and Adrian followed. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now? Celeste goes to trial for fraud and theft. You finish losing your fortune in divorce court, and I rebuild my life without either of you in it." "Vivian, stop!" She turned on him with sudden fury. "You don't get to say my name like we're still connected. You don't get to look sad and expect sympathy. You made choices, Adrian. You chose Celeste over me every single day for 3 years. You chose to steal from our marriage to fund your affair. You chose arrogance over integrity." "I know. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you still think you're the victim in this story." Poor Adrian, seduced by the evil younger sister, manipulated by his vindictive wife. But that's not what happened. Then what did happen? Vivian stepped closer, close enough that Adrian could see the absolute absence of mercy in her eyes. "You destroyed yourself," she said, "and then you were so busy feeling sorry about it that you didn't notice Celeste was destroying you worse. That's what happened. You were a predator who got eaten by a bigger predator, and I'm the one who walked away because I finally stopped believing I could save you from yourself." Adrian looked like he wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come because she was right. About all of it. "I loved you," he said finally. Vivian laughed, sharp and bitter. "No, you didn't. You loved the idea of me, the perfect duchess who made you look good and never asked for anything real. You loved having me as an accessory. But actual love, the kind that requires sacrifice and honesty and putting someone else first, you're not capable of that." She walked away, and this time Adrian didn't follow. Vivian left the Savoy and climbed into the car, where Maxwell waited with the patient neutrality of someone who'd witnessed this entire arc and wasn't surprised by how it ended. "Home, Your Grace?" he asked. "Home," she confirmed. They drove through London in silence, and Vivian watched the city lights blur past and felt something that might have been peace if peace wasn't still so unfamiliar. She'd won. Celeste was facing criminal charges. Adrian was financially ruined. The two people who'd betrayed her most completely were suffering consequences that would follow them for years. It should have felt better than it did. But victory without satisfaction is just another kind of emptiness, and Vivian was discovering that revenge didn't actually heal anything. It just created new spaces where the old wounds used to be. She'd spent 3 months planning Celeste's destruction with surgical precision. She'd waited for exactly the right moment, assembled perfect evidence, delivered justice with maximum impact. And now it was done, and she felt nothing but tired. Back at the estate, Vivian walked through rooms that echoed with 7 years of performance and pretense. She poured herself wine from Adrian's collection, the good stuff he'd always saved for special occasions that never quite materialized. Tonight felt special enough. She stood in the conservatory where she'd spent so many mornings pretending to be happy and finally let herself feel the full weight of what the last 3 months had cost her. The energy spent documenting betrayal, the nights planning legal strategy, the emotional effort required to maintain composure while systematically destroying her sister. It had been necessary. It had been justified. It had been exactly what Celeste deserved. But it had also hollowed Vivian out in ways she was only beginning to understand. She'd transformed herself from perfect duchess to ruthless destroyer, and the woman looking back from the darkened windows was someone she barely recognized. Stronger, yes. More dangerous, certainly, but also more alone than she'd ever been, standing in an empty estate surrounded by everything she'd fought to keep, and wondering if any of it had been worth the price of becoming someone who could hurt people as completely as she'd hurt Celeste tonight. Vivian finished her wine and made a decision that would change everything that came after. She was done fighting, done seeking revenge, done defining herself by the people who'd betrayed her. Tomorrow she would start building something new. Not a response to Adrian or Celeste, not a reaction to their choices, just something that belonged entirely to her. But tonight, she stood in the ruins of her old life and grieved for the woman she'd been before betrayal had taught her how to be ruthless. That woman was gone, and the one who remained had survived by becoming exactly the kind of person she used to think she'd never be. Hard, cold, willing to destroy without hesitation when destruction was necessary. Vivian Ashford Blackthorne had learned the fundamental truth that power without consequence was theater. Now she understood the corollary. Consequence without transformation was just cruelty wearing justice's mask. She'd won the war, but the victory tasted like ashes and emptiness, and the bitter knowledge that some battles damaged the winner as much as the loser. The estate was silent around her, and Vivian was finally, completely, irrevocably alone with the person she'd become. Adrian woke up in his hotel room 3 days after the Savoy disaster with the kind of headache that suggested his body was staging a mutiny against the amount of whiskey he'd consumed. The morning light felt like an accusation. His phone showed 47 missed calls, most from numbers he didn't recognize, probably journalists hoping he'd give them a quote about watching his former mistress get arrested at her own engagement party. He ignored all of them. The news coverage had been brutal and comprehensive. Every major outlet in London had run some version of the story. Duke's mistress arrested for fraud at lavish engagement party. The photographs were worse. Celeste being led away by security, mascara running, the white dress that cost a fortune now looking like a costume. Marcus Bellamy's face frozen in shock, and in the background of several shots, Adrian himself, looking diminished and defeated and exactly like what he was. A man who'd destroyed everything and gained nothing. But the worst part, the detail that haunted him more than anything else, was the single photograph of Vivian leaving the Savoy. She looked powerful in a way that made Adrian's chest ache with recognition of what he'd lost. Composed, certain, absolutely untouchable. The caption read, "Duchess Vivian Ashford Blackthorne exits after exposing sister's fraud scheme, proving once again that revenge is a dish best served with impeccable documentation." Adrian studied that photograph for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the image with the one he'd married 7 years ago. That Vivian had been softer somehow, more willing to bend, more invested in maintaining peace than demanding justice. This Vivian looked like she could burn cities and sleep soundly afterward. He'd created her. His betrayal had transformed someone gentle into something diamond hard, and Adrian was only now understanding that transformation was permanent. His phone rang. Unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Mr. Blackthorne," a crisp female voice said, "my name is Detective Sarah Chen with the Metropolitan Police Fraud Division. I need to ask you some questions about financial transactions between yourself and Celeste Ashford. I already gave a statement to my attorney." "Yes, but new information has surfaced. We're expanding the investigation." Adrian felt his stomach drop. Expanding how? "We've discovered evidence suggesting the fraud may have been more extensive than originally believed. The prosecutor wants to establish whether you were complicit in the theft or merely another victim." "I was a victim," Adrian said, and hated how defensive he sounded. "Then you won't mind coming in for questioning. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Scotland Yard. Bring your attorney." The call ended before Adrian could respond. He sat on the edge of his hotel bed, understanding with sudden clarity that this wasn't over. Vivian hadn't just destroyed Celeste at the Savoy. She'd opened an investigation that would scrutinize every financial decision Adrian had made for the past 3 years, every account he'd given Celeste access to, every transfer he'd authorized, every suspicious transaction that could be interpreted as conspiracy rather than stupidity. If they decided he'd been complicit, if they determined he'd known about the theft and allowed it to continue, he wasn't just facing financial ruin anymore. He was facing criminal charges. Adrian called Bradford Cunningham, his attorney, who answered with the weary patience of someone who'd been expecting this development. "I heard," Bradford said before Adrian could speak. "The police contacted me an hour ago." "This is bad, Mr. Blackthorne." "How bad?" "If they can prove you knew what Celeste was doing and failed to report it, conspiracy to commit fraud. 3 to 7 years, potentially. If they think you actively helped her, it gets significantly worse." "I didn't help her. I didn't even know what she was doing until James showed me the bank statements." "Can you prove you didn't know?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Adrian thought about all the times he'd signed documents without reading them, all the accounts he'd given Celeste access to without asking questions, all the transfers he'd authorized because she'd asked sweetly and he'd been too distracted by desire to think critically. "No," he admitted. "I can't prove I didn't know." "Then we have a problem." Bradford sighed the way he probably sighed before delivering terminal diagnoses. "I'll meet you at Scotland Yard tomorrow. In the meantime, don't talk to anyone. Don't post anything on social media. Don't try to contact Vivian or Celeste or anyone connected to this mess. Too late on that last one." "What did you do?" "I went to the Savoy party. I watched the whole thing." Bradford was silent for a long moment. "You know Vivian planned that specifically so you'd be there, right? She wanted you to watch Celeste's destruction because she wanted you to understand that she's not someone who forgives anymore. She's someone who destroys systematically and without mercy." "I know. Do you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, you keep making the same mistake. You keep underestimating the women in your life. You underestimated Vivian's capacity for ruthlessness. You underestimated Celeste's capacity for theft. And now you're sitting in a hotel room waiting for the next disaster instead of preparing for it." Adrian wanted to argue, but Bradford was right about all of it. After the call ended, Adrian stood at his window and looked out at London with the bleak awareness that the city didn't care about his problems. Millions of people moving through their lives, building and destroying and loving and betraying, and not one of them gave a damn that Duke Adrian Blackthorne was watching his entire existence collapse in slow motion. There was something liberating about that anonymity. When you had nothing left to lose, when even your freedom was uncertain, when the worst-case scenario was already unfolding, there was a strange clarity that emerged. Adrian had spent his whole life afraid of losing status, losing wealth, losing the respect that came with his title. Now that he'd lost almost everything, he was discovering that survival stripped away pretense with brutal efficiency. He wasn't Duke Adrian Blackthorne anymore. He was just Adrian, broke, humiliated, possibly facing prison, but still breathing. The question was what he did with whatever time he had left before the legal system finished what Vivian had started. Vivian spent the morning after the Savoy party handling the logistical aftermath of public destruction. Calls from attorneys confirming that Celeste was being held pending bail hearing, calls from journalists requesting interviews, calls from society acquaintances suddenly very interested in maintaining their connection to the woman who just orchestrated the most spectacular revenge London had witnessed in years. She declined all interview requests and most social invitations. The only call she answered with genuine interest came from Margaret Hastings at 11 a.m. "The prosecution is very happy with the evidence," Margaret said. "They're confident they can get a conviction on multiple fraud charges. Celeste is looking at 3 to 5 years minimum." "Good," Vivian said, but the satisfaction felt hollow. "There's a complication, though. They want to investigate whether Adrian was complicit. If he knew about the theft and allowed it to continue, he could be charged as an accessory." Vivian was quiet, processing this information and what it meant. Adrian was an arrogant fool, but she didn't actually believe he'd known about Celeste's systematic theft. He'd been too busy enjoying the affair to notice he was being robbed. "He didn't know," she said finally. "Can you prove that?" "No. But I know him, Margaret. He's selfish and reckless, but he's not that kind of calculating. Celeste played him as thoroughly as she played everyone else. The prosecution doesn't care about your character assessment. They care about whether they can make the charges stick." Vivian stood and walked to the windows overlooking the estate gardens. Below, Staff were trimming hedges with the patient precision of people whose lives didn't include spectacular betrayals and criminal investigations. "I don't want Adrian to go to prison," she said. "Why not? He destroyed your marriage. He humiliated you publicly. Why do you care what happens to him?" "Because I'm not trying to destroy him. I'm trying to move on. There's a difference." Margaret was silent for a moment. "You're a better person than I am," she said finally. "Most people in your position would want maximum damage to everyone involved. Most people aren't exhausted from 3 months of planning revenge that didn't actually make them feel better." Vivian ended the call and sat in the conservatory where she'd spent so many mornings pretending to be happy. The estate was hers now, legally and completely. The divorce settlement had been finalized 2 weeks ago, giving her the London properties, most of the investments, and enough money to maintain her lifestyle indefinitely. She'd won everything she fought for, and it felt like ashes. The emptiness that had started at the Savoy party had expanded into something larger and more concerning. Vivian had transformed herself into a weapon sharp enough to destroy her enemies, but weapons didn't know how to be anything except dangerous. She'd spent 3 months learning how to hurt people efficiently, and now she didn't know how to stop. The woman looking back from her reflection in the conservatory windows was powerful and untouchable and absolutely alone. Maxwell appeared in the doorway with his usual impeccable timing. "Your Grace, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." "Who?" "Your husband." Maxwell's expression remained neutral, but Vivian caught the slight emphasis on husband, the reminder that legally Adrian still held that title even though emotionally he'd forfeited it years ago. "I don't want to see him. He says he'll wait as long as necessary. He's in the drive currently. It's raining." "Good. Let him wait." But even as she said it, Vivian felt something stir that might have been curiosity. What could Adrian possibly want badly enough to show up unannounced after everything that had happened? "How long has he been there?" she asked. "Approximately 40 minutes. Maxwell paused. "He looks rather desperate, if I may observe." "Fine. Show him to the East Parlor. I'll see him in 10 minutes. Maxwell nodded and disappeared. Vivian took those 10 minutes to compose herself, to rebuild the armor she'd worn at the Savoy, to become again the woman who could face Adrian without flinching. When she entered the East Parlor, Adrian was standing by the windows looking at the gardens. He'd lost weight. The suit he wore was off the rack and slightly wrong in the shoulders. He looked diminished in ways that went beyond clothing, like someone had taken the arrogant duke she'd married and run him through a machine that removed everything except the basic human underneath. He turned when she entered, and Vivian saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Fear. Not anxiety or worry or concern. Actual fear. The kind that came from understanding you were completely out of options, and the person standing across from you held your entire future in their hands. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "You have 5 minutes." Adrian nodded like he'd expected that. "The police think I helped Celeste steal from the estate. They think I was complicit." "Were you?" "No." "God, no. I didn't know what she was doing until James showed me the statements. But I can't prove I didn't know, Vivian. I signed things without reading them. I gave her access to accounts without asking questions. On paper, it looks like I was either criminally stupid or actively participating." "Probably both," Vivian said coldly. "I know." Adrian stepped forward and Vivian saw his hands were shaking slightly. "I know I don't deserve help. I know I destroyed everything good in my life because I was selfish and arrogant and convinced that consequences were things that happened to other people. But I'm asking anyway. Asking what exactly? Tell them I didn't know. Tell the prosecutors that I'm an idiot but not a criminal. You were married to me for 7 years. You know the difference." Vivian studied him with clinical detachment. This was the man she'd loved once, back when she was young enough to believe that love could transform people into better versions of themselves. This was the man who'd promised to cherish her and then spent 3 years systematically betraying that promise with her own sister. "Why should I help you?" she asked. "Because you're not cruel. You're angry and you're hurt, and you have every right to want me to suffer. But you're not the kind of person who would let someone go to prison for something they didn't do just because you hate them. You're assuming I still care enough to hate you. Maybe I just feel nothing." Adrian flinched like she'd hit him. "That's worse," he said quietly. Vivian walked to the windows and stood beside him, both of them looking at gardens that represented everything Adrian had lost. The estate, the legacy, the carefully maintained illusion of aristocratic permanence. "I could help you," she said. "I could tell the prosecutors that you're a faithless husband, but probably not a knowing accomplice to fraud. It might be enough to keep you out of prison." "Then why don't you?" "Because I want to understand something first." She turned to face him fully. "Did you ever actually love me? Or was I just a convenient accessory to the life you wanted?" Adrian was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw in a way Vivian had never heard. "I don't know," he said. "I thought I did. I told myself I did. But I don't think I understood what love actually required until I'd already destroyed it." The honesty was startling. Vivian had expected excuses, justifications, the kind of self-serving narrative Adrian had always specialized in. Instead, he was giving her something that might have been genuine self-awareness, arriving approximately 7 years too late to matter. "You destroyed me," she said quietly. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece over years of being treated like I was interchangeable with anyone who could play Duchess adequately. "Do you understand that?" "I do now. Now is worthless, Adrian. Now is after the damage is done. Now is when you've lost everything and suddenly discovered consequences are real. Now doesn't fix anything. I know." He looked at her with eyes that were too honest, too raw, showing her someone she'd never seen before. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking to fix anything. I'm just asking you not to let me go to prison for something I didn't do." Vivian felt something crack inside her chest, some last piece of armor that had been holding her together since the Savoy. She was so tired of being hard, so tired of carrying rage like a weapon, so tired of defining herself by the people who'd hurt her. "I'll talk to the prosecutors," she said. "I'll tell them you're guilty of stupidity and infidelity, but probably not conspiracy. What they do with that information is up to them." Adrian's shoulders sagged with relief, so profound it was almost physical. "Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I refuse to let what you did to me turn me into someone who uses the legal system as a weapon just because I can." She walked toward the door, but Adrian's voice stopped her. "For what it's worth, Vivian, I'm sorry. Not just for getting caught. For all of it. For wasting 7 years of your life. For being too blind and selfish to appreciate what I had until it was gone." Vivian turned back and looked at him one last time. The apology didn't fix anything. It didn't undo the betrayal or erase the pain or make the last 3 months of legal warfare and systematic revenge feel worthwhile. But it was something, a small acknowledgement that he finally understood what he'd destroyed. "Goodbye, Adrian," she said, and meant it in every possible sense. 6 weeks later, Vivian sat in her attorney's office reviewing the final settlement documents. The divorce was complete. The fraud investigation had concluded with Celeste being sentenced to 4 years for theft and forgery, while Adrian avoided criminal charges after Vivian's testimony established his stupidity as genuine rather than performative. Everything was resolved. Everything was finished, and Vivian felt nothing except the same hollow exhaustion that had characterized the last several months. "You should be celebrating," Margaret said, reviewing the asset division one final time. "You got the estate, the investments, the properties, and your reputation intact. This is what complete victory looks like. Then why does it feel so empty? Because revenge doesn't actually heal anything. It just redistributes the pain." Vivian signed the final documents and watched Margaret countersign them with practiced efficiency. 7 years of marriage reduced to paperwork and legal specifications. A relationship that had once felt permanent now officially terminated with stamps and signatures. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked. Vivian thought about the question. She had money, property, freedom, and absolutely no idea what to do with any of it. She'd spent 3 months destroying her enemies, and 7 years before that being the perfect Duchess. She'd forgotten how to be just Vivian, if she'd ever known in the first place. "I'm going to leave," she said. "Leave London?" "Leave everything. The estate, the society, the whole performance. I'm going to sell the properties and disappear somewhere nobody knows who I am or what happened." "That's quite drastic." "This whole situation was drastic. I became someone I don't recognize, Margaret. I spent 3 months planning how to hurt people as efficiently as possible. I testified against my own sister. I destroyed my husband's life and felt satisfied about it. That's not who I want to be. So you're running away." "No." Vivian stood and gathered her things. "I'm choosing myself. For the first time in my adult life, I'm choosing what I want instead of what I'm supposed to want. That's not running, that's surviving. She left the attorney's office and walked through London streets that felt both familiar and alien. The city had witnessed her transformation from hopeful bride to betrayed wife to avenging duchess. Now it was going to witness her final act, complete disappearance. Over the next month, Vivian systematically dismantled her life with the same precision she'd used to destroy Celeste. She sold the estate to a tech billionaire who wanted a piece of aristocratic history. She liquidated investments and consolidated assets into accounts only she could access. She severed social connections with polite but firm finality. And on a Tuesday morning in late spring, she boarded a plane to Edinburgh without telling anyone where she was going or when she'd return. The woman who'd been Duchess Vivian Ashford Blackthorne ceased to exist. In her place was just Vivian. No title, no performance, no audience demanding perfection. Just a woman who'd survived betrayal by learning to be ruthless and was now trying to remember how to be gentle again. Adrian heard about Vivian's disappearance from James Whitmore, who called 6 weeks after the divorce finalized with news that filtered through society like wildfire. "She's gone," James said. "Sold everything. Left London. Nobody knows where." Adrian sat in the small flat he'd rented in a neighborhood that would have horrified his younger self, and felt something that might have been grief, if grief wasn't too presumptuous for someone who'd forfeited the right to mourn. Did she say why? She didn't say anything, just settled her affairs and vanished. James paused. "I heard she left you something, though. A letter. Your attorney should have it." Adrian called Bradford, who confirmed that yes, a letter had arrived marked for Adrian's attention only. Bradford read it over the phone with the clinical detachment of someone delivering information rather than emotion. "Adrian," the letter began in Vivian's precise handwriting. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not because I'm afraid of you or running from what happened, but because I refuse to let the worst period of my life define whatever comes next. You asked me once if I ever actually loved you. The answer is yes. I loved you completely and desperately, and in ways that probably weren't healthy. I loved you enough to ignore warning signs. I loved you enough to forgive smaller betrayals. I loved you enough to transform myself into whatever you seemed to need. That was my mistake. Not loving you, but loving you more than I loved myself. I don't hate you, Adrian. I don't wish you harm. I just wish you'd been capable of appreciating what you had before you destroyed it. Maybe someday you'll find someone else and treat them better because you learned from what you did to me. I hope so. Everyone deserves the chance to be better than their worst choices. But I won't be here to witness it. I've spent 7 years performing the role of your wife and 3 months performing the role of your destroyer. I'm done performing. I'm going to find out who I am when nobody's watching and nothing's expected. If there's any justice in the world, you'll do the same. Don't try to find me. Don't try to contact me. Let this be the ending we both deserve. Clean, final, and merciful. Goodbye, Adrian. I hope you find peace. I really do. Vivian. Bradford finished reading, and the silence stretched between them like distance. Do you want me to investigate where she went? He asked. No, Adrian said. She asked me to let her go. It's probably the only thing she's asked for that I'm actually capable of giving. After the call ended, Adrian sat in his small flat with its IKEA furniture and its view of nothing special and thought about the letter. Vivian had given him mercy he didn't deserve and wisdom he hadn't earned. She'd walked away not because he'd broken her, but because she'd finally stopped believing she needed him to be whole. It was the most devastating rejection imaginable. Not anger or hatred, but simple indifference wrapped in gentle hope that he'd become better without her. Adrian looked around his diminished life and understood with sudden clarity that this was his bottom. The point where everything he'd been had been stripped away, and all that remained was the question of what he'd build from the ruins. He could spend the rest of his life mourning what he'd lost, or he could actually learn from it. The choice was simple. The execution would be brutal, but for the first time since this nightmare started, Adrian felt something that wasn't shame or regret or hollow desperation. He felt possibility, not for reconciliation or redemption or any grand narrative about becoming a better man, just the possibility that somewhere in his ruined life was a person worth salvaging if he was willing to do the work nobody was going to witness or celebrate. Vivian was gone. Celeste was in prison. And Adrian was alone with the consequences of every choice he'd ever made. It was exactly what he deserved. And somehow, finally, that felt like truth instead of tragedy. 3 months after leaving London, Vivian stood on a beach in Scotland watching the ocean perform its endless routine of arrival and departure. The cottage she'd rented was small and anonymous, the kind of place that didn't care about titles or scandals or the elaborate machinery of aristocratic destruction. She'd spent the time reading, walking, sleeping without nightmares for the first time in years. She'd stopped checking London news, stopped caring about society gossip, stopped defining herself by the people who'd hurt her or the revenge she'd extracted. The hollowness was still there, but it felt different now. Less like emptiness and more like space waiting to be filled with something new. Her phone rang. Margaret Hastings calling with final details about asset transfers. "Everything's settled," Margaret said. "The last property closed yesterday. You're officially free and clear." "Thank you," Vivian said, "for everything. What will you do now?" Vivian looked at the ocean and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, not peace yet, but something adjacent to both. A sense that she was standing at the beginning of something instead of the end. "I don't know," she said honestly, "and for the first time in my life, that doesn't terrify me. That's growth. Or trauma. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." Margaret laughed. "Well, whatever it is, you earned it. Not many people could have survived what you did and come out the other side functional. I'm not sure I am functional. I'm just differently broken. Aren't we all?" After the call ended, Vivian sat on the beach and watched the sun set over water that didn't care about her story. The ocean had been performing this routine for millions of years. It would continue long after her life was over. There was comfort in that cosmic indifference. She'd survived betrayal by becoming ruthless. Now she was learning to survive peace by becoming gentle again. It was harder than she'd expected. Gentleness required vulnerability. Vulnerability required trust. And trust was the thing Adrian and Celeste had destroyed so thoroughly that rebuilding it felt like trying to construct a cathedral from ash. But Vivian was discovering that survival wasn't binary. You didn't either break or endure. You broke and endured simultaneously. You carried damage and hope in equal measure. You were destroyed and rebuilt so many times that eventually the distinction between the two became meaningless. She was both the woman who'd thrown her husband out in fury and the woman who'd later testified to keep him out of prison. She was both the sister who'd orchestrated Celeste's public destruction and the sister who still sometimes cried about what they'd lost. She was both the Duchess, who'd played perfect for 7 years, and the woman sitting on a Scottish beach in jeans and an old sweater watching the ocean with no performance required. All of it was true. All of it was her. And somewhere in that complexity was the beginning of actual peace instead of just the absence of war. Vivian stood and walked back to her cottage as the last light disappeared from the sky. Tomorrow, she'd wake up and still be alone. Still be carrying damage that would probably never fully heal. Still be figuring out who she was when nobody was watching. But she'd also be free. Free from the marriage that had slowly killed her. Free from the sister who'd betrayed her. Free from the need to be perfect or ruthless or anything except exactly who she was in this moment. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she married Adrian 7 years ago, but it was the ending she'd fought for, and that made it hers in ways nothing else had ever been. The woman Adrian Blackthorne had betrayed refused to look back. Not because she was running, but because she finally understood that some chapters ended not with resolution, but with release. And release, Vivian was discovering, was its own kind of victory. 2 years passed like a slow exhale after holding your breath through a catastrophe. Time moved differently when you had nothing to prove and no one watching. Adrian learned this truth sitting in a cramped office above a bookshop in Bristol, reviewing accounts for small businesses that couldn't afford the kind of high-powered financial consultants he used to be. The work was honest and mundane and paid approximately 1/10 of what he'd spent monthly on wine during his days as Duke Blackthorne. He'd stopped using the title 18 months ago. Just Adrian now. Sometimes Mr. Blackthorne when clients needed formality. But never Duke. That man had died in a hotel room in Kensington the night he realized he'd lost everything worth keeping. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or cinematic. No moment of clarity where violins swelled and understanding descended like divine intervention. Just the slow accumulation of days where he chose differently than he had before. Days where he read contracts instead of signing them blind. Days where he asked questions instead of assuming he already knew the answers. Days where he recognized his own capacity for self-deception and built safeguards against it. People think change happens in moments of crisis, but that's only when you become desperate enough to consider it. Real change happens in the 1,000 tiny decisions afterward when crisis has faded and old patterns whisper that maybe you didn't need to be different after all. Adrian had spent 2 years refusing those whispers. His phone rang. James Whitmore, calling from London for their monthly check-in that had started as obligation and somehow transformed into something approaching friendship again. "How's Bristol treating you?" James asked. "Like, I'm nobody special. It's perfect. Still doing the accounting thing?" Still doing the accounting thing. Helped a restaurant owner figure out why his food costs were bleeding him dry yesterday. Saved him maybe £3,000 a year. Look at you being useful. James's voice carried that familiar mixture of mockery and genuine affection. Your father would be horrified. My father would have been horrified by most of my life. At least now I'm disappointing him by being helpful instead of destructive. Fair point. James paused, and Adrian heard the shift in tone that meant the conversation was about to get serious. I have news. About Vivian. Adrian felt his chest tighten but kept his voice level. I told you I don't want updates about her. I know. But this is different. She's back in London. The words hit like a physical blow. Vivian had been gone for 2 years, disappeared so thoroughly that even the most determined society gossips had eventually stopped speculating about her location. Adrian had accepted her absence as permanent, the final consequence of what he'd destroyed. Why? He asked. Her father died. Heart attack last week. The funeral is tomorrow at the family estate in Surrey. Adrian closed his eyes. Lord Richard Ashford had been one of the few people who'd tried to warn Vivian away from marrying Adrian in the first place. He'd seen through the charm and status to the fundamental weakness underneath. He'd been right about everything. I should send flowers, Adrian said. You should do whatever feels right. But Adrian? James's voice was gentle now, the way it got when he was about to say something Adrian needed to hear. Don't go to the funeral. Don't try to contact her. She came back for her father. Not for you. Let her grieve without having to deal with your presence. I know. Do you? Because I remember a version of you who would have showed up anyway, convinced your support was necessary, even when it was the opposite of what she needed. That version of me is dead, Adrian said quietly. I killed him myself 2 years ago. Good. Keep him dead. After the call ended, Adrian sat in his small office and thought about Vivian standing at her father's funeral, surrounded by people offering condolences that couldn't touch the grief. He thought about writing to her. He thought about sending flowers with a card expressing sympathy that would probably feel like insult coming from him. He thought about all the ways he could insert himself into her pain and convince himself it was kindness instead of selfishness. Then he did nothing, because sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone you'd hurt was leave them completely alone. Vivian stood in the family chapel at the Surrey estate, watching her father's casket being carried past centuries of Ashford family monuments, and felt the weight of endings pressing down with geological force. Her mother sat in the front pew, diminished by grief into someone Vivian barely recognized. The chapel was full of people who'd known her father, respected him, built their lives in the orbit of his quiet competence and unshakable integrity. He'd been the one constant in Vivian's life. The one person who'd never asked her to be anything except herself. The one voice that had warned her about Adrian and then supported her anyway when she chose not to listen. The one man who taught her that real strength wasn't about domination, but about knowing when to fight and when to let go. And now he was gone. The service was traditional and dignified, and everything her father would have wanted. Vivian delivered a eulogy that managed to capture his essence without breaking down completely. She shook hands with what felt like hundreds of people offering sympathy she couldn't quite absorb. She played the role of grieving daughter with the same perfection she'd once played the role of perfect duchess. And somewhere during the reception afterward, she realized she was performing again. She stepped outside into the gardens where she and her father used to walk when she was young, and life was simple enough to solve with conversation. The autumn air was sharp and clear. Leaves fell with the patient certainty of seasonal death and rebirth. You look tired. Vivian turned to find her mother standing in the doorway, elegant even in grief, watching her with eyes that saw too much. I am tired, Vivian admitted. Your father worried about you after you disappeared. He understood why you needed to leave, but he worried you were running from yourself instead of toward something new. Was he right? Her mother smiled sadly. He usually was. But that doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. Sometimes running from yourself is the only way to figure out who you actually are. They stood together in silence for a moment, two women who'd both loved the same man and were now learning to exist in the space his absence created. The estate is yours now, her mother said. He left it to you. The house, the land, the investments, all of it. Vivian felt something crack inside her chest. I don't want it, I know. But he wanted you to have it anyway. He said if nothing else, you'd earn the right to choose what to do with your inheritance instead of having it chosen for you. The weight of that gift was staggering. Her father had given her not just property, but agency. The power to build or sell or transform according to her own vision instead of anyone else's expectations. There's something else, her mother said, reaching into her jacket pocket. He wrote you a letter, made me promise to give it to you after the funeral. She handed Vivian an envelope with her name written in her father's precise handwriting. Vivian held it like it might explode. I'll leave you alone, her mother said gently, and disappeared back into the house. Vivian sat on the stone bench where she'd sat 1,000 times before and opened the letter with shaking hands. My dearest Vivian, it began, if you're reading this, I've died and you've come home to bury me. I'm sorry you had to come back. I know London represents pain you worked hard to escape, but I'm grateful you're there, even temporarily, because it means I get to tell you one last thing. You are not defined by what happened to you, not by Adrian's betrayal, not by Celeste's theft, not by the marriage that failed or the revenge you extracted or the 2 years you spent hiding from the life you used to have. You are defined by what you do next. I've watched you survive things that would have destroyed weaker people. I've watched you transform pain into power, and then realize power without purpose is just another kind of emptiness. I've watched you become ruthless when ruthlessness was necessary, and then choose gentleness when you could have stayed hard forever. That's the measure of actual strength, my darling girl. Not the ability to hurt people who've hurt you, but the ability to stop hurting them when continuing would be easier. The estate is yours now. What you do with it is entirely your choice. Sell it and use the money to build something new. Keep it and transform it into whatever vision calls to you. Give it away if that feels right. I don't care what you choose as long as the choice is yours and yours alone. But whatever you decide, stop running. You've earned the right to stand still. You've earned the right to build instead of flee. You've earned the right to be happy without permission or performance or the exhausting work of pretending you're not still carrying damage. Forgive yourself for loving the wrong person. Forgive yourself for trusting the wrong sister. Forgive yourself for becoming ruthless enough to destroy them both, and then gentle enough to regret it. Forgive yourself for being human in a world that punishes vulnerability and rewards performance. And then, when you've done all that impossible work, live the kind of life that would make me proud. Not because you owe it to me, but because you deserve it. I love you, Vivian. I always have. I always will. Even from whatever comes after this. Your father. Vivian read the letter 3 times before she could see through the tears enough to fold it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Her father had given her permission to stop performing, stop running, stop defining herself by the worst things that had happened to her. The question was whether she was brave enough to accept that permission. Chat. Adrian heard about Lord Ashford's funeral through the society pages he still occasionally read in moments of masochistic nostalgia. The coverage included photographs of Vivian looking elegant and devastated, surrounded by family and friends who'd supported her through the divorce and its aftermath. She looked older in the photographs. Not aged, but matured, like she'd lived through things that had added depth instead of just damage. Her expression carried a gravity that made Adrian's chest ache with recognition of everything he'd lost. He studied those photographs longer than he should have, trying to read her emotional state from pixels in professional photography. Wondering if she ever thought about him. Wondering if she hated him still, or had moved past hatred into the kind of indifference that was worse. wondering if she'd forgiven herself for loving someone who'd proven unworthy of that love. He wanted to reach out, wanted to send condolences that might open a conversation that could lead to something like closure. But James's words echoed in his mind. Let her grieve without having to deal with your presence. So Adrian did nothing. Again, it was becoming a pattern. The discipline of absence. The practice of not inserting himself into situations where his presence would cause more harm than good. It was harder than the old arrogance had been, this constant self-restraint, but it felt closer to actual integrity than anything he'd managed during his years as Duke Blackthorne. 3 weeks after the funeral, Adrian received a letter forwarded from his old London address. His name written in handwriting he'd recognize anywhere. Vivian's. His hand shook opening it. Some part of him expected recrimination or final thoughts on his fundamental worthlessness. Instead, he found something that looked like peace. Adrian, the letter began. My father died 3 weeks ago. You probably heard. London society loves a funeral almost as much as they love a scandal. I'm writing because his death made me think about endings and how rarely we get to choose them. Our marriage ended badly. Necessarily, but badly. We hurt each other in ways that will probably echo for years, but we never got to say goodbye properly. Just legal documents and mutual destruction and then silence. So this is me saying goodbye properly. I don't forgive you for the affair. I don't forgive Celeste for the theft. Those betrayals are permanent and the damage is real, and pretending otherwise would diminish what I survived. But I've stopped letting those betrayals define my entire existence. I've stopped carrying rage like armor. I've stopped measuring my worth by how thoroughly I destroyed the people who hurt me. I'm trying to forgive myself instead, for loving you when I should have left, for ignoring warning signs because I wanted the fairy tale, for becoming ruthless enough to orchestrate Celeste's public destruction and then being surprised when victory felt hollow. You asked me once if I'd ever actually loved you. I've thought about that question for 2 years. The answer is yes. I loved you desperately and completely and in ways that probably weren't healthy. But that love was real, even if what we built from it wasn't sustainable. I don't hate you, Adrian. I don't wish you harm. I just wish we'd both been different people capable of building something that didn't require one of us to diminish ourselves. My father left me his estate. I'm going to keep it and transform it into something new. A foundation, maybe. Something that helps people rebuild after betrayal. I don't know exactly what yet, but I know it won't be about revenge or destruction or any of the things I excelled at during our divorce. It'll be about creation instead. I hope you've found peace wherever you are. I hope you've learned from what happened. I hope you've forgiven yourself for being human and flawed and capable of hurting people you claim to love. And I hope you understand that this is goodbye, final and complete. Not because I'm angry, but because we both deserve to move forward without the weight of what we did to each other. Be well, Adrian. Be better than you were with me. Be the person you were supposed to become before arrogance convinced you that consequences were optional. Vivian. Adrian read the letter until he had it memorized. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where he kept the few things from his old life that still mattered. Vivian had given him something more valuable than forgiveness. She'd given him release, permission to stop defining himself by the worst thing he'd ever done. He sat in his small Bristol flat and felt something shift in his chest. Not healing exactly, not redemption, but something adjacent to both. A sense that maybe survival didn't require carrying guilt like penance forever. Maybe you could acknowledge the damage you'd caused, do the work to become better, and then actually move forward instead of just existing in the wreckage. Adrian pulled out paper and wrote a response he knew he'd never send. Writing it was the point, not the delivery. Vivian, he wrote. Thank you for the goodbye. Thank you for the honesty. Thank you for showing me what actual strength looks like when it's not performing for anyone. I've spent 2 years trying to become someone who wouldn't make the same mistakes. I don't know if I've succeeded. I don't know if transformation is even possible or if we're all just damage walking around in human suits pretending we've changed. But I'm trying, and your letter reminds me why that effort matters even when nobody's watching. I hope your foundation helps people. I hope you build something beautiful from the ruins. I hope you find the kind of peace that doesn't require performing or protecting or any of the exhausting work we both excelled at. And I hope someday, when enough time has passed that the wounds have scarred over, you think about our marriage and remember at least one good moment. One morning where we were happy. One conversation that mattered. One instant where what we had felt real and sustainable and worth the risk. I know I destroyed it all. I know I have no right to ask you to remember anything except the betrayal. But I'm asking anyway. Because even ruined things were beautiful once, and I want to believe that beauty mattered even if it didn't last. Goodbye, Vivian. For real this time. For always. Adrian. He folded the unsent letter and put it in the drawer next to hers. Then he went back to his accounting work, helping small business owners avoid the kind of financial disasters he'd once sleepwalked into because numbers seemed less important than status. The irony wasn't lost on him. By 5 years after the divorce, Vivian stood in the renovated Surrey estate and watched the first group of participants arrive for the inaugural session of the Ashford Foundation. 20 women who'd survived betrayal in various forms: divorce, affairs, financial abuse, systematic gaslighting. Women who'd lost themselves in marriages that had slowly poisoned them and were now trying to figure out who they were afterward. Vivian had spent 3 years building this program. Therapy, financial counseling, legal support, and most importantly, a community of people who understood that survival wasn't binary. You didn't either break or endure. You did both simultaneously and learned to carry the contradiction with whatever grace you could manage. The foundation had become Vivian's purpose. Not revenge, not destruction. Just the patient work of helping people rebuild from ruins she understood intimately. She'd stopped reading London Society pages years ago. Stopped caring about Adrian or Celeste or any of the people who'd populated her old life. Celeste had been released from prison after 3 years and disappeared again, probably to whatever bolt hole she'd prepared before her arrest. Adrian had vanished into obscurity so complete that even the most determined gossips had stopped tracking him. Vivian was glad. Their absence created space for something new to grow, and she'd spent 5 years cultivating that growth with the same precision she'd once applied to being the perfect Duchess. The difference was this growth belonged entirely to her. Margaret Hastings appeared at her elbow, older now but still sharp, still occasionally reminding Vivian that revenge had once felt satisfying, even if it ultimately proved hollow. "This is beautiful," Margaret said, gesturing at the gathered women. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so," Vivian said, "though I think he'd also point out that I'm still performing, just for a different audience." "Maybe. But at least now you're performing something that helps people instead of just maintaining appearances." They stood together watching the orientation session begin. One of the counselors, a woman who'd survived her own spectacular betrayal, was talking about the difference between forgiveness and release. How you could acknowledge damage without letting it define your entire existence. How you could move forward without pretending the past didn't matter. Vivian listened and recognized her own journey in those words. She'd spent years thinking forgiveness meant absolving Adrian and Celeste of responsibility for what they'd done. But that wasn't forgiveness at all. That was just performance pretending to be healing. Real forgiveness was releasing yourself from the obligation to carry their choices as your own failure. Real forgiveness was accepting that people hurt you, and then choosing not to let that hurt determine everything that came after. Real forgiveness was the work she'd been doing for 5 years without realizing it had a name. Someone touched her arm. One of the participants, early 50s, expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion of prolonged emotional warfare. "Lady Vivian," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for creating this program. My husband had an affair with my business partner. They stole everything I built, and I've spent 2 years thinking I was crazy for still being angry about it." "You're not crazy," Vivian said gently. "Anger is a reasonable response to betrayal. The question is what you do with it. What did you do with yours?" Vivian thought about the question, about the night she'd thrown Adrian out, about orchestrating Celeste's destruction at the Savoy, about 2 years hiding in Scotland, about the foundation she'd built from the ruins. "I burned it as fuel for a while," she said honestly. "Then I realized fuel burns out eventually, and you're left with whatever you built while it was burning. I'm trying to make sure what I built actually matters instead of just being expensive wreckage." The woman nodded, like this made sense. Then she returned to the session, and Vivian watched her integrate into the group with the tentative hope of someone who'd forgotten what safety felt like. This was why the foundation mattered. Not because it fixed anything, not because it erased damage, but because it reminded people that survival was possible even when it felt impossible, that you could be destroyed and rebuilt simultaneously, that endings could transform into beginnings if you were willing to do the brutal work of forgiveness without pretending it was easy. Margaret left, and Vivian stood alone in the estate her father had given her, watching women learn to rebuild from betrayal, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, not peace yet, but something close enough to both that she could finally imagine what her life might look like when the healing was actually finished instead of just ongoing. 7 years after the divorce, Adrian received an invitation that made his hands shake. The Ashford Foundation Gala benefiting survivors of marital betrayal and financial abuse. Black tie event at the Surrey estate, hosted by Vivian Ashford. She'd reclaimed her maiden name apparently, erased Blackthorn from her identity entirely. Adrian couldn't blame her. He stared at the invitation trying to understand why he'd received it. Some mistake, surely. No version of reality existed where Vivian wanted him at her fundraising gala. Unless this was some elaborate revenge he hadn't seen coming, a final humiliation delivered 7 years late. His phone rang. James Whitmore. Because of course James would know about this before Adrian finished processing it. "Did you get the invitation?" James asked. "Yes. Is this a joke?" "No joke. Vivian's assistant contacted me last week asking for your current address. Said Vivian wanted to invite you personally." "Why?" James was quiet for a moment. "Maybe because 7 years is long enough that you're not the villain anymore. Just another person who made mistakes and survived them." "I'm not going." "Why not?" "Because showing up at her event feels like inserting myself into her life after she explicitly asked me not to. Because I have no right to celebrate her success when I contributed to the destruction that made her rebuild necessary. Because you're still punishing yourself," James interrupted. "Which is noble or whatever, but at some point you have to accept that maybe she's offering something besides judgment. What could she possibly be offering?" "I don't know. Why don't you ask her?" After the call ended, Adrian held the invitation and thought about all the reasons not to go. The list was long and compelling and absolutely rooted in the kind of self-protection he'd been practicing for 7 years. Then he thought about Vivian's letter from 5 years ago, the one where she'd said goodbye and wished him peace and given him permission to stop defining himself by the worst thing he'd ever done. Maybe this invitation was her way of confirming that permission was still valid. Maybe she was offering closure that didn't require shame or performance or any of the exhausting emotional machinery they'd both excelled at during their marriage. Maybe she was just being kind to someone she'd once loved who'd systematically destroyed that love through arrogance and neglect. Adrian didn't know which possibility scared him more. 8. The gala was exactly the kind of event Vivian had once planned as Duchess. Elegant without being ostentatious. Sophisticated without being pretentious. Every detail perfect, but in ways that made perfection look effortless instead of exhausting. Adrian arrived late, after most of the guests had settled into comfortable clusters of conversation and champagne. He wore a suit he'd saved 6 months to buy, nothing like the custom tailoring of his previous life, but adequate for the occasion. Several people recognized him. He saw the moment understanding registered, saw them whisper to their companions, saw the social calculation as they decided whether acknowledging his presence would be gracious or awkward. He didn't care. He was here for one person, and she was standing near the windows talking to someone who looked vaguely familiar from London society's endless roster of wealthy people with causes. Vivian looked stunning in a way that had nothing to do with the dress or jewelry, and everything to do with the confidence she wore like armor that had been tempered in fire and emerged stronger for it. She looked happy. Genuinely happy in ways Adrian didn't remember from their marriage. She looked free. He waited until her conversation ended and then approached with the kind of hesitant uncertainty he'd learned was appropriate for someone who'd forfeited the right to certainty years ago. "Vivian," he said quietly. She turned and her expression cycled through surprise and something else Adrian couldn't quite read before settling into careful neutrality. "Adrian, you came. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I should. But the invitation felt like something I needed to answer in person." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Two people who'd once known each other intimately and now had no idea what scripts applied to this particular scene. "Thank you for coming," Vivian said finally. I know it's strange, inviting you here after everything, but I wanted you to see what I built from the wreckage. It's incredible. The foundation, this whole program. You've helped a lot of people. I'm trying to." She smiled and it reached her eyes. "Turns out surviving betrayal gives you useful perspective for helping other people survive theirs. I'm glad you found purpose in it." Adrian paused, choosing words carefully. "I've wanted to tell you for years that I'm sorry. Not for getting caught, not for losing everything, but for being the kind of person who thought betrayal was acceptable as long as I compartmentalized it adequately." "I know," Vivian said simply. "I got your letter, the one you never sent." Adrian's heart stopped. "How? James gave it to me 3 years ago. Said you'd written it after receiving mine, and then put it in a drawer because you thought sending it would be selfish. He thought I deserved to read it anyway." Adrian was going to kill James, after hugging him, maybe simultaneously. "I meant every word," he said, "about hoping you'd remember at least one good moment from our marriage. About wanting to believe the beauty mattered, even if it didn't last." Vivian's expression softened. "There were good moments, Adrian, probably more than either of us remember because we're both conditioned to focus on how it ended instead of how it began. That's not healthy for either of us." She gestured toward the gardens, and they walked together, leaving the Gallinois behind for something quieter and more conducive to conversations that required honesty. "I've forgiven myself," Vivian said when they were alone among the manicured hedges and autumn flowers, "for loving you, for trusting Celeste, for becoming ruthless enough to destroy you both, and then gentle enough to regret the destruction. That's been the hardest work of the last 7 years. Have you forgiven me?" Vivian considered the question with the careful precision of someone who'd thought about it extensively. "I've released you," she said finally, "which is different from forgiveness, but close enough that the distinction doesn't matter anymore. You made terrible choices that hurt me catastrophically, but I made the choice to marry you. I made the choice to ignore warning signs. I made the choice to stay longer than I should have because I was invested in a fantasy that didn't match reality. We both contributed to the destruction, just in different ways. That's generous. It's honest." She stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "You're not the villain of my story, Adrian. You're just someone who was broken in ways I couldn't fix and didn't recognize until too late. And I'm someone who tried to fix you instead of accepting you as you were and deciding whether that was acceptable. We were both performing," Adrian said. "I was performing Duke. You were performing Perfect Duchess. Neither of us knew how to be real with each other. No. But we know now. And that knowledge cost us everything." They stood in the garden where Lord Ashford had once walked with his daughter, two people who'd destroyed each other learning to exist in the same space without destruction being the default response. "I'm proud of you," Adrian said, "for building this, for turning pain into purpose, for surviving what I did to you and becoming someone stronger instead of just harder." Vivian's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "Thank you. That means more than you know. And I want you to know that I'm different too. Not redeemed or forgiven or any of those grand narratives, just different. I do accounting for small businesses in Bristol. I help people avoid the kind of financial disasters I once created. It's humble work, and I'm never going to be Duke Blackthorne again, but I don't want to be. That man destroyed everything he touched." "Good," Vivian said firmly. "Keep him dead." They walked back toward the gala in comfortable silence. Two people who'd once been married and were now just survivors of the same catastrophe, capable of kindness without requiring reconciliation. At the entrance, Vivian stopped and touched his arm lightly. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I'm glad you're well. I'm glad we both survived what we did to each other." "Me too," Adrian said, and meant it with every part of himself that had learned to be honest. Vivian returned to her gala, and Adrian watched her integrate back into her life with the seamless grace of someone who'd found their purpose and was executing it flawlessly. He didn't stay for the rest of the event. Didn't need to. He'd gotten what he came for. Confirmation that Vivian was happy, that she'd built something meaningful, that she'd moved forward instead of just existing in the wreckage. And more importantly, confirmation that he could exist in her proximity without either of them needing to perform old wounds or rehash ancient damage. They'd both survived. That was enough. Okay. Adrian returned to Bristol on the late train, watching the countryside slide past in darkness, thinking about endings and how rarely they provided the closure people wanted. He and Vivian would never be friends, never have the kind of relationship that transcended what they'd done to each other. But they'd achieved something possibly more valuable: indifference that wasn't hostile, distance that wasn't punitive, release that didn't require pretending the damage hadn't been real. He'd spent 7 years learning to be someone different, someone who read contracts and asked questions and recognized his own capacity for self-deception. Someone who helped people instead of exploiting them. Someone who understood that consequences were real and inevitable and not something you could charm your way out of. That person was lonely sometimes, lived in a small flat, and did unglamorous work and would never command rooms or inspire envy or possess the kind of power he'd once wielded without appreciation. But that person could look at himself in the mirror without flinching. And after 7 years of brutal self-examination, Adrian had learned that was worth more than status or wealth or any of the things he'd once thought defined success. 10 years after the divorce, Vivian stood in the Foundation's expanded campus and watched the 100th cohort of participants arrive. The program had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. Multiple locations, international reach, partnerships with universities and legal organizations and financial institutions. She'd built an empire from empathy instead of exploitation. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her mother had died 3 years ago, leaving Vivian completely alone with the legacy of the Ashford name and the foundation that carried it forward. She'd dated occasionally over the years. Nothing serious, nothing that required the kind of vulnerability marriage demanded. She was content with her work, her purpose, the knowledge that she was helping people avoid or survive the kind of destruction she'd endured. Some days she still thought about Adrian, wondered if he'd maintained whatever transformation he'd started, wondered if he was happy or just existing, wondered if he thought about her with the same occasional nostalgia she felt for the person he might have been if he'd been capable of growth before destruction forced it. But those thoughts came less frequently now, more like checking an old wound that had healed than actively hurting. She'd forgiven herself, released him, built something that mattered. That was enough. Bismarck. 15 years after the divorce, Adrian died quietly in a Bristol hospital after a brief illness that came on fast and ended faster. He was 54. He died alone but not lonely, having built a small life of genuine connections and honest work, and the kind of peace that came from accepting you'd never be extraordinary but could still be decent. James Whitmore handled the funeral arrangements, a small service attended by maybe 20 people who'd known Adrian in his Bristol years and genuinely liked the man he'd become. No society figures, no aristocratic pageantry, just a straightforward acknowledgement that someone who'd once been important had died after spending his final years being useful instead. James called Vivian personally to tell her. "I thought you should know," he said. "Adrian died yesterday." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, processing information that should have felt more significant than it did. Was he happy? At the end? I think so. He'd built something small but real, helped a lot of people, became someone worth knowing instead of just someone worth knowing about. "I'm glad," Vivian said, and meant it. "He left something for you." A letter. James paused. He updated it every year, apparently. Always the same sentiments, but refined slightly. "I'll send it if you want. Please." The letter arrived 2 days later. Vivian opened it in the conservatory of the Surrey estate, where she'd once sat as a young bride pretending to be happy, and now sat as a middle-aged woman who'd learned that happiness was quieter and harder won than she'd imagined. "Vivian," the letter began in Adrian's familiar handwriting, grown shakier with age but still recognizable. "If you're reading this, I've died, and James thought you deserved closure. I want you to know that I spent the last 15 years becoming someone different. Not better, necessarily. Different. Someone who helped instead of hurt. Someone who read contracts and asked questions and recognized that arrogance was just ignorance wearing expensive clothes. I never remarried. Never found what we had with anyone else. Not because I was pining for you or waiting for reconciliation, but because I learned that I wasn't capable of the kind of partnership marriage requires. I was too fundamentally selfish, too conditioned to prioritize my own comfort over someone else's well-being. That self-knowledge arrived 15 years too late to save our marriage, but just in time to prevent me from destroying someone else. I hope the foundation continues thriving. I hope you found happiness, or at least peace. I hope you think about our marriage occasionally and remember that some of it was real and beautiful, even if I destroyed it through negligence and betrayal. And I hope you've forgiven yourself for loving someone who didn't deserve it. Because that love wasn't your failure. It was mine for not being worthy of it. Thank you for showing me what actual strength looks like. Thank you for releasing me instead of destroying me. Thank you for building something meaningful from the ruins we created together. I'm sorry I couldn't be who you needed me to be, but I'm grateful you became exactly who you needed to be. Goodbye, Vivian, for the last time, forever. Adrian. Vivian read the letter twice and then folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where she kept the few remnants of her old life that still mattered. She didn't cry, didn't feel devastated, just a quiet melancholy for the man Adrian might have been if he'd learned earlier what life eventually taught him. She stood at the windows watching the Foundation campus below, watching women arrive seeking help, surviving betrayals that echoed her own, and felt the weight of ending settling around her with patient finality. Adrian was gone. Celeste had disappeared years ago, probably living under a false identity somewhere extradition couldn't reach. And Vivian was still here, still building, still transforming pain into purpose, with the patient precision of someone who'd learned that survival was ongoing rather than finite. She'd won, not because she'd destroyed her enemies, but because she'd outlived them while building something that mattered. That was the truth nobody told you about revenge. It was satisfying for approximately 5 minutes and hollow for everything after. Real victory was quieter, building instead of burning, creating instead of destroying, surviving instead of just enduring. Vivian Ashford had learned that lesson in blood and fire and systematic betrayal. Now she was teaching it to others. And somewhere in that transmission of hard-won wisdom was the meaning she'd been seeking since the night she'd thrown Adrian out of the estate 15 years ago. Not happiness exactly, not peace yet, but something close enough to both that the distinction had stopped mattering. She'd survived. She'd built. She'd transformed. And the woman looking back from her reflection in the conservatory windows was someone she finally recognized and respected and maybe even loved. That was enough. That was everything. That was the ending she'd earned through 15 years of brutal honesty and harder work. The Duke had ended up alone, having learned too late what really mattered. And the Duchess had ended up alone too, having learned just in time that alone wasn't the same as empty if you filled the space with purpose. Two people who'd destroyed each other had both survived, but only one of them had transformed that survival into something worth the cost. Vivian stood in the conservatory watching evening settle over the foundation that bore her family's name, and felt the weight of endings and beginnings balanced perfectly against each other. This was peace, hard-won and complicated and absolutely hers. And after 15 years of fighting for it, Vivian finally allowed herself to rest.